The Lincoln Legacy. Prologue. The midday sun shone brightly on the devastation below. The day was hot, humid, and the boys in gray suffered from the blazing sunshine and the enemy's counter-battery fire as they awaited the order to advance. Their thoughts were not of the armed young men in blue facing them across an expanse of open field. Instead, their minds longed for home, family, friends, sweethearts, but especially their mothers, even those who knew her not. The noises and smells of battle penetrated their pores, but not their souls, for most turned to their God for comfort, seeking protection, mercy, salvation, and forgiveness. They faithfully obeyed the bugles, drums, and whistles that called on them to emerge from the camouflage and protection of the trees. They lined up, shoulder to shoulder, with their comrades. Pride, courage, duty, confidence, excitement, trepidation, anxiety, and fear enveloped them as they heard the words they had anticipated for hours but hoped would never come. Forward! March! Chapter 1. David Wade loved books. He cherished his private library, both paper and electronic, meticulously catalogued. His traditional book collection greedily occupied most of the walls on the upper level of his rooftop penthouse, while his e-collection was securely stored on several physical hard drives and online clouds. He liked being in the company of his beloved tomes. They were the best and most faithful of friends. Every evening at midnight he would settle into his custom-designed high-back chair, built to accommodate his over 6-foot frame, with a glass of his favorite liquid spirit, Grand Marnier on ice, and read. Many enjoy reading while listening to music, but not he, his ears being sensitive in that way. David Wade kept monastic hours. His workdays were long, and his weeks even longer, especially this one. Having recently taken on several big cases simultaneously, they all converged to a successful climax yesterday. His clients were happy, and so was his banker. Large deposits had been made in his various accounts. Success meant money. Remuneration well earned. His fortune was substantial, allowing him the freedom to take on only the files that interested and challenged him. Vacations were rare, and rest breaks even rarer. At 33, he believed his mind and body were at their apex, a convergence of mental acuity and physical stamina that cross paths in exact symmetry only once in a lifetime. His goal was to fully enjoy this crucial phase in his life and take advantage of everything stimulating that came his way, while he was still young and vigorous, before the shadows began to gather. He shuffled in his chair and resumed reading. It was a good read, which usually meant that it combined work with pleasure, his only kind of fun reading. This evening he chose to peruse one of his first edition classical volumes, whose original smooth leather binding and vintage smell pleased his primal senses, as well as his intellectual faculties. He sipped his elixir in good human solitude when one of his ever-present companion devices alerted him of an incoming missive. The text was brief, but to the point. David, can you meet me at the Smithsonian tomorrow afternoon? I have something interesting to offer you. I think it will be worth the trip. Doris. Wade was not shocked or even surprised by the tantalizing message, but he was curious. Doris Shelby was the first female secretary of the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., and former professor at New York City's Columbia University. She had taught Wade during his education at the Ivy League school and was later hired by him as a consultant on several of his early investigations. When Dr. Shelby accepted the post in the nation's capital, Wade had sent her a congratulatory message, but had received no response. Tell me more, Wade answered. I need you to help me locate some DNA, she fired back instantly. "Whose DNA?" he wrote. The reply took longer than normal. Wade impatiently waited. His eyes did not abandon the small screen, not even when he reached for his glass and brought it to his lips for another taste. Then finally the answer appeared. Abraham Lincoln's DNA. Chapter 2. Wade arrived early the next morning at his Fifth Avenue Manhattan office, 2/3 up the Empire State Building. His office door was closed, guaranteeing silence. Deep in thought, he was startled by the sound of a confident knock. He raised his head and proclaimed, "It opens." The heavy soundproof door unlatched and slowly swung towards him, adding a tinge of mystery to the knocker's identity. Up until then, he had been alone, having sent his executive assistant Jenny to the financial district on a task. A female silhouette eventually took shape and revealed itself beneath the entrance frame. The woman was beautiful, sophisticated, slim, and sexy. "Julia!" he gasped. "What are you doing here?" "I just happened to be in town and decided to drop by," she answered easily. He smiled. The last time he saw her was in London, more than a month ago. "What are you doing in New York?" he asked, standing. She delicately placed one foot in front of the other, with a hand on her hip and her chin slightly up, posing. "I'm here for Fashion Week." "Isn't that in February?" She offered him a slight pout with her lips and inclined her head to one side. "Well, I guess I'm a bit early." Wade made a face. He knew better. Julia Cartier was a celebrated designer from Montreal, now based in northern Italy, where they had first met several months ago. She was well connected and in high demand on both sides of the pond. She didn't need an official event to be in America's top clothing mecca. "Actually," she continued teasingly, "I'm here to prepare for that week. My participation in each of the 4 major international fashion weeks needs to be planned months in advance." Collectively known as the Big Four, including those in London, Paris, and her adopted city of Milan, New York Fashion Week, held in September and February of each year, is a semi-annual series of events when international fashion collections are shown to the press, buyers, and the general public. Julia was a regular at all these happenings, with New York being her favorite. "Have a seat," Wade offered, gesturing to one of the posh chairs facing his desk. Julia slowly scanned his office before entering, then pronounced her verdict. "I like it," she nodded. "First class, just like you, my dear." Wade smiled at the compliment, sitting back down behind his desk. Flattery wasn't something he trolled for, but it was always appreciated. "So," she said, hanging on to the word, "how about I buy you breakfast?" "No can do," he answered, shaking his head. "I've got to be in Washington this afternoon." "Washington, D.C.?" she asked in a disappointed tone. "That's right," he said. "The nation's capital awaits." "At what time do you need to be there?" "I have a business meeting at 2 p.m. I'll be leaving for the airport soon." Julia squinted her eyes and nipped her lower lip, exposing gleaming white teeth. "Why fly when you can drive?" "I hate driving, Julia." "Forget the airport and all its hassles. I will drive you." "What?" Wade reacted incredulously. "That's crazy." "No, it's not. I have the wheels, and you know I love to drive." "It's impossible," he argued. "Again, no, it is not," this time responding with fervor, hoping to be taken seriously. "I have completed my work here in the city and had planned a few days R&R before flying home. What is it, she began working her handheld device. "Less than a 4-hour drive? And, she continued to search. At least the same travel time, door to door by plane, taking into account getting to and from the airport and dealing with security and all the other hoops and hurdles. And of course, the flight could be delayed or even canceled. Yeah, but... Forget the yas and buts, David. It is a no-brainer. My car will get you there with time to spare. Wade watched her smile wildly and convincingly as she concluded her closing arguments using an ever-present, spicy accent. Suddenly, Jenny Bradford appeared from nowhere and walked into his office to lay a large brown envelope on his organized desk, cornered by neat piles of old-school papers next to his various desktop computers containing new-school piles of pixels. "I'm sorry to just walk in, Mr. Wade, but you said you wanted these documents immediately." Jenny acknowledged the woman in her boss's office with a polite, closed-mouth smile, then turned to leave. "Thanks, Jen." Wade stored the envelope in the top drawer of his desk. "Oh, Jen," calling her back, "please meet Ms. Julia Cartier." Julia stood. Jenny offered her hand. "It's very nice to meet you, Ms. Cartier." "Likewise, Jenny." The exchange was neutral and formal. The two women knew of each other, but had never spoken for long, or for any reason other than the connecting of calls to and from the man sitting close to them. Wade, for his part, noticed Jenny's lovely perfume competing with Julia's. It was a battle of the titans. Jenny turned and walked dutifully out of the office towards her workstation. Julia's eyes stayed with the petite blonde until the young woman moved beyond her sightline. Julia sat back down and waited for Wade to finish texting on one of his devices. He pressed send, put the device back on his desk, and looked towards the open office door. "Jen," he spoke loud enough for her to hear him, "cancel my flight to D.C. I'll be traveling by car." Chapter 3. Wade noticed Julia was not comfortable in his office building's elevator. The compartment was full of people during the ride down from the 64th floor to the historic beautiful foyer. Before the elevator came to a complete stop, Wade leaned down to Julia and whispered, "Are you all right?" She looked at him with a face paler than usual and whispered back, "I don't like crowded, confined areas." She took 2 deep breaths. "I hate elevators. I avoid them as much as I can." The door slid open, causing Wade to dismiss the explanation, thereby once again not recognizing or acknowledging his friend's mild condition of claustrophobia. They exited the building into the cool, crisp late autumn air. Julia gave a parking voucher to a uniformed valet who rapidly began the process of retrieving her vehicle. "How long has Jenny been working for you, David?" "About 2 years." "She's cute," Julia remarked. "I guess so," he answered nonchalantly. "What do you mean, I guess so? Come on, she is very, very cute." "If you say so." Wade looked at his watch as Julia sighed and rolled her eyes. "What's her story? She seems very young. Is she at least 20? Wade chuckled. "Yeah, she's 25. Only 4 years your junior, and very smart, hard-working, and competent." "Where is she from?" Persisting in her interrogation. Wade was not annoyed by the questions about his young aide, but was hoping the arrival of Julia's car would end the conversation. "Jen is from Beantown. She's part of a fancy rich family with a long Boston Brahmin pedigree. New England aristocracy." "She seems a bit serious," Julia commented. "Well, what we do is serious business," he retorted with a smirk. "What is your business exactly?" "Oh, a bit of this, a bit of that, you know. I find stuff." Yeah, I've noticed." Julia had accompanied him on 2 recent adventures, but Wade was always evasive on the exact nature of his undertakings. She knew he was a lawyer and investigator, but did not fully comprehend the precise scope of his profession. I was surprised to find you alone in your office, except for Jenny. I like it that way, he stated firmly. I have my outside sources to help me find things. What kind of things? Whatever needs to be found. Sensing Wade would say no more on the topic, Julia asked him about living and working in Manhattan. It's great, Wade answered with an uplift in his voice, obviously happy to be talking about something else. He turned his head back and looked up. I always dreamed of working in this iconic skyscraper and living next to the greatest park in the world. I look forward to showing you my place sometime. I think you'll like it. I'm sure I will, David, smiling at the thought. I'm certain I will. Wade lifted the collar of his jacket to the sudden cool breeze. He noticed that Julia didn't seem bothered by the cold. I guess her Canadian blood hasn't yet been replaced by the Mediterranean kind, he thought to himself. By the way, Julia, where are you staying? I was set up at the Waldorf Astoria, but checked out this morning, ready for adventure. They instantly met each other's eyes at the word, with broad smiles. Finally, Julia exclaimed. Here comes our ride. Wade first caught the vehicle from the corner of his eye and turned to meet it head-on. He could not believe his eyes. Approaching was the chariot that would take them to the nation's capital, an automobile that could not go unnoticed. It was pink, bright pink, a bright pink shiny Corvette. Chapter 4. Julia, I know you love fast sports cars, but this is truly something else. You like? As I said, it is truly something else. Wade had not yet fully absorbed the shock of his friend's means of transport, and he was still unsure on how to react. He recalled her choice of premium speedsters in England and Italy, but this vehicle left him stunned and somewhat speechless. Within minutes, however, Wade began to appreciate the comforts the inside had to offer. The Vette was a two-seater, allowing for ample legroom. He resolved to remain neutral regarding the outside color, consoled when recalling that Elvis Presley had been well known for his love of pink Cadillacs, and the boss, Bruce Springsteen's song, Pink Cadillac, was a classic. He thus resolved not to comment negatively to Julia, who appeared totally enchanted behind the wheel. Navigating the busy and sometimes crazy streets of downtown Manhattan was never easy, but Julia was in her element, enjoying every second of the challenge. I'm impressed, Julia. How do you know Manhattan so well? I learned fast, she responded gleefully. The two friends caught up on each other's lives with some small talk, but once on the highway, Wade turned to his devices. His first missive was targeted for Jenny, whom he instructed to transfer bonus money to 3 Denary members that had performed especially well on recent jobs. Denary, meaning 10 in Latin, was Wade's specialized garrison of acolytes. Each member of the team possessed resources and expertise available at all times for the benefit of the group's founder and leader, David Wade. Membership in the club was at his invitation only, and any breach of the strict rules meant immediate expulsion. The risks were high, but so were the rewards. Wade always dealt with each Denary member one-on-one, for they didn't officially know of each other. The work he requested usually dealt with isolated aspects of a case. He guarded the big picture fervidly. Although he needed help with the pieces, he was the one who put the puzzle together. Denary was not an alliance of equals. David Wade was the boss. The low rumbling noise caused by Julia's pink racer against the highway pavement began bothering Wade. To mask the sound, he extracted a pair of custom-molded earplugs and inserted them discreetly. The transparent silicone plugs were effective at reducing certain sounds and overall decibels, but even the best devices were not able to completely block the intrusion of all sound. This was unfortunate, for Wade sometimes wished he could click a switch and eliminate all noise, thus plunging into the comfort of auditory darkness. Julia was not aware of her friend's acoustic problems and had never noticed his protective gear. "What are those?" she asked. Nothing. Just earplugs." "What for?" He answered in a way that would not open the conversation towards detailed explanations of his complicated hearing status. Perhaps one day he would give her the full 9 yards, but not here and not now. "They help me concentrate," he responded in a partially true manner. She accepted the explanation and consequently resolved not to play any music when riding with him. "Do you want to stop anywhere along the way, David, or drive right through?" "No stopping," he answered, shaking his head slightly. "I like being early, never late. Early." He ignited his tablet. "Now, I've got a few things to review." Julia acknowledged his decision and refocused on the road. The hours of travel were not wasted on Wade. The driving time had permitted him to dispense with all accumulated office work, now allowing the New York investigator to completely focus on what awaited him in Washington, D.C. As Julia merged onto the Capitol Beltway, a 64-mile interstate highway that surrounds the city, Wade glanced at the dashboard's clock and concluded that Julia had been right. Driving had taken no longer than flying. Wade had once dated a young graduate student from this area. She had done the traveling up to Manhattan to join him on weekends. Their time as a couple had been brief, but intense. Hard on the ears. She was a screamer. Relationships can be noisy. "What's waiting for us in Washington, David?" He smiled. "You'll see." As usual, Julia was not made privy to Wade's plans in advance, but whatever they were, she knew they would be interesting. "What does the D.C. mean anyway?" She followed up with a second question. "The D.C. stands for District of Columbia." Julia waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Although not fully satisfied with the answer, she left it at that. Founded by the nation's first president and named to honor him, Washington, D.C. is not officially designated as a city, but rather a federal district under the exclusive jurisdiction of the Congress. The district is therefore not a part of any state. Located along the Potomac River and covering parts of the bordering states of Maryland and Virginia, the Washington metropolitan area, of which the district is the principal city, has a population of over 6 million. All 3 branches of the United States federal government are centered in the district: the President, Congress, and Supreme Court. The city hosts foreign embassies as well as the headquarters of many international and non-profit organizations, lobbying groups, professional associations, and trade unions. Washington is also home to many arts and cultural centers, national monuments, and museums, including the Smithsonian Institution, which is situated on the splendid National Mall in the heart of downtown. Having smoothly penetrated the Beltway, Julia drove across the Potomac on the Arlington Memorial Bridge and headed towards the mall. "I hope you do not mind, David. I just want to take a moment to look at something I have always wished of you up close." She pulled her car to the side of the busy road and stopped in front of an American national monument in the form of a Greek Doric temple, containing a large seated sculpture of the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Chapter 5. The Smithsonian Institution, established in 1846, is a group of museums and research centers administered by the United States government. Known as the nation's attic for its eclectic holdings of 150 million items, the institution's Washington, D.C. nucleus of 19 museums and galleries, 9 research centers, and zoo is the largest such complex in the world. Many of the facilities are considered historical or architectural landmarks. 11 are on the National Mall, including the Museum of American History, Air and Space Museum, and Natural History Museum. The iconic Smithsonian Institution building, known as the Castle, was the first structure erected constructed with red stone and completed in 1855. Wade disembarked Julia's conspicuous roadrunner at the castle, leaving her to find parking. She would catch up later, allowing him time to find the person he was scheduled to meet with. Entering the celebrated edifice, Wade felt a slight chill of excitement. Walking these hallowed halls always brought back memories of his many childhood visits. He also recalled a high school term paper he had written on James Smithson, the British scientist who had generously bequeathed his estate to the United States of America to found at Washington under the name of the Smithsonian Institution, an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. The motives behind Smithson's bequest remain mysterious. He had never traveled to the U.S., nor had close contact with anyone in the country. Some suggest that his bequest reflected his interest in the American Enlightenment ideals of democracy and universal education. The castle houses the administrative offices and information center of the Smithsonian. A crypt just inside the north entrance contains the tomb of James Smithson. Wade entered the appropriate office and asked a young male receptionist to see the museum's secretary, Dr. Doris Shelby, the 14th secretary of this august body and the first woman to take up the mantle. Waiting, he glanced at the historic photos lining the walls and perused the many plaques, including one that proudly reminded guests that the Smithsonian has a large number of traveling exhibitions, making sure that its mission to increase and diffuse knowledge is ongoing. Wade knew the Smithsonian holds close ties with hundreds of museums across the U.S. and around the world, he having dealt with more than one. Known as Smithsonian affiliates, collections of artifacts are offered to these museums in the form of long-term loans from the Smithsonian. Julia walked into the office waiting area to join Wade, just as Doris Shelby arrived to greet them both with a wide smile and loud voice, almost too wide and loud for her small face. Nearing Washington City, Wade had texted Dr. Shelby informing her that he had decided to drive down with a friend. Knowing that Wade's meeting was to be private and confidential, Julia gladly accepted the doctor's offer of a guided tour by one of her aides around the castle and its visitor center, which had recently been renovated and modernized to include interactive displays and maps. As Julia departed, Dr. Shelby led Wade to her office. Once inside the confines of her workplace, Dr. Shelby turned to Wade and complimented him. My, David, you are a good-looking young man. How are you?" Wade smiled and answered politely, knowing that the older Dr. Shelby was not a flirt, having always been over-complimentary to everyone she met, especially former students, addressing them like a kind-natured aunt. The good doctor was a diminutive woman in her mid-60s with straight hair, sensibly arranged at shoulder's length. The flat-soled shoes she wore did not help her height deficiency. Barely 5 feet tall and less than 100 pounds, this tiny female dynamo really packed a punch in the academic world, a world she still enjoyed and had spent her whole career conquering. "I asked you to come here, David, because you will probably need to start your research at the National Archives." Wade was unsure, waiting patiently for her to explain exactly what he was being asked to do. "David, as mentioned, I need you to find some of Abraham Lincoln's DNA." "But doesn't the Smithsonian already have a lot of that stuff?" he asked. "For example, hair samples from the president or his children." "Yes, we do have some of those items, and others do exist in various museums and private collections, but all those materials are considered, as you know, dead DNA." Wade looked at her with perplexed anticipation. "What I'm asking you to find, David, is our beloved assassinated president's living DNA." Chapter 6. "Do you know much about the Lincoln biography, David?" "A bit, I guess." He was being modest. Honest Abe was one of his childhood heroes and his favorite president. He had read dozens of books dealing with the man from Illinois. As a youth, Wade had visited many Lincoln historical sites with his grandfather, who often praised his grandson's imaginative ideas and smart solutions to problems with the phrase, "Good thinkin', Lincoln." "Take a look at this, David. It adds a new twist to the man's life." Wade knew, since Lincoln had not kept a diary or written an autobiography, that the early years of Abraham Lincoln's life were somewhat shrouded in mystery and folklore. Dr. Shelby explained that the document he was about to read had been prepared by researchers hired by one of the Smithsonian's big corporate donors. Having hit a wall, they decided to turn to her for help. Help, she hoped, that would ultimately come from David Wade. "Before I read this, Doris, tell me, who is the corporate sponsor that prepared this info?" "I can't tell you that, David. They wish to remain anonymous, but I can tell you that they are prepared to pay you quite well if you should decide to take on the matter." Intrigued, Wade repositioned himself in his chair and began reading. During the first sentence, Dr. Shelby excused herself and exited the room, closing the door behind her. The document was not long, one full page, but the new information Wade encountered was colossal. The paper began by stating the well-known fact that Abraham Lincoln's direct family line was extinguished during the last century with the death of his last linear descendant. It went on to summarize the familiar datum about the future president's early personal life. He was born in 1809 and grew up on the western frontier in Kentucky and later Indiana. In 1818, 9-year-old Abraham lost his caring birth mother, Nancy, who died after a brief illness. The following year, his father Thomas married Sarah Bush Johnson, who became Abe's loving stepmother. In 1830, 21-year-old Abraham joined his family in a move to Illinois. After helping his father establish a farm, Lincoln set out on his own. In New Salem, Illinois, the young Lincoln met Anne Rutledge, believed by many to be his first love. In 1835, a wave of typhoid hit the town and Anne died at the age of 22. This sad event left Lincoln severely depressed. The exact nature of the Lincoln-Rutledge relationship has been fiercely debated. Although it is fairly well established the two were at least friends, many have speculated that there was much more to their friendship, including the authors of the document Wade was reading. It's also well known that Abraham Lincoln had married only once, in 1842, to Mary Todd in Springfield, Illinois. Their 22-year union had produced 4 sons. The document given to Wade, however, claimed otherwise. It alleged that Lincoln was the father of a child with Anne Rutledge, a child that survived, while its mother did not. According to this document, Abraham Lincoln had fathered a 5th offspring, a boy. Chapter 7. Could Abraham Lincoln have fathered a child without history knowing of it? Wade looked out the office window onto the mall and wondered. Doris re-entered her office and sat behind a massive mahogany desk, making her look very small. "So," she asked plainly, "what do you think?" Wade glanced down at the document still held by his right-hand fingers, then looked up at the doctor and simply shrugged. "That's it, David? No other reaction?" "Actually," spreading out the word, "I have too many reactions to this information." Pointing at the piece of paper he still firmly held, he continued, "If this is true, He hesitated. "I do understand the implications." "I'm sure you have many questions, David, so fire away." "Okay," he stated firmly, composing himself. "Why does your donor want living DNA from Lincoln?" Doris moved deeper into her executive chair. Our donor is a large multinational conglomerate with interests in many fields and industries, including cutting-edge cryogenics. They wish to preserve the living DNA of certain people for future study and use, Wade cut her off. Perhaps, she responded. But the point is, they wish to locate these living materials and freeze them as high-quality, uncontaminated specimens, as opposed to the many low-grade, incomplete, and adulterated specimens that already exist. All right, now, how did your donor arrive at the conclusions set out in this? He pointed to the document once again, but this time folded and tucked it into his jacket pocket. They are based on revelations in a stash of papers, letters, and diaries from the late 19th century. When can I see those materials? Wade asked with measured zeal. Never, I'm afraid. They were all destroyed in an attic fire at the turn of the century. Then how do we know all this? The custodian of the papers summarized their contents in a letter to a friend a few weeks after the blaze. Does that letter still exist? Yes, it does, Doris announced. And here it is. The Smithsonian's boss leaned forward and handed Wade an old piece of yellowed paper, protected and enclosed by acrylic glass. Wade read the letter's contents, easily decipherable due to the fine penmanship employed at its composition. He looked up at Dr. Shelby. I can't carry this around, Doris. Of course not. Here's an exact high-def paper copy. I will also send an e-copy to your personal mail account. Wade stored this second document as he had the first. This is what they are willing to pay you for your trouble. She handed Wade a small envelope with a dollar figure inside. When he saw the amount offered, he did not flinch, but was very pleased by the first digit and the many zeros that followed. Fine, Doris, I accept. I assume you will be my one and only contact. That's correct. Ask your assistant to send me your banking info so that I can immediately arrange transfer of 60% of the total amount. Is that okay? 50% would have been sufficient, but 60% is well appreciated. She nodded, stood, and handed him 3 compact DNA test kits. She then walked towards her office door, signaling an end to their private meeting. Before opening the door, she turned to Wade, who now stood, towering over her short frame. Looking up at his handsome face, she said, "Oh, and by the way, the money will be channeled to your account via an untraceable banking source." She smiled. As I said, our donor wishes to remain anonymous in this caper. Back in the reception area, Julia seemed pleased to see Wade and Dr. Shelby. Did you enjoy your tour, my dear? Yes, I did. It was most interesting. They all shook hands. Then Wade and Julia walked the corridors of the castle towards the main exit in a leisurely pace. Wade usually moved fast, but not this time. Julia assumed he was cogitating and thus distracted as he strode along the hallways and towards the steps leading outside. Where to now, David? Well, I've been strongly advised to visit the National Archives building here in the city. Okay then, the National Archives it is, but I've got my own archives, Wade interrupted. Drive us to the airport. The airport? Where are we going? When was the last time you visited your parents, Julia? Chapter 8. André Barthélemy waddled the streets of Place Royale in Old Quebec City, enjoying the quaint historic sights. Although the white-bearded short man of hefty proportions rarely left his beloved seaside abode along France's Atlantic coast, he did make an exception every few years when his cultural and linguistic cousins in the New World requested his presence. The Canadian province of Quebec, considered an ethnic nation, took its genealogy very seriously. So seriously that every 2 years it held a prestigious international genealogical symposium in its old capital, inviting select experts in the field to appear as lecturers for the mostly French-speaking audience. Barthélemy never refused this biennial invitation, for he had a passionate interest and curiosity about the thousands of France natives that branched off centuries ago to what originally was called New France. When the French royal colony fell to the British in 1763, the territory of Quebec and its predominantly French-Canadian inhabitants were ushered down a tumultuous path over the next 2 centuries as pawns located at a pivotal cross-section of the continent between English and American interests. Having taken in some much-needed fresh air, albeit cold and crisp, Barthélemy re-entered the grand foyer of the Château Frontenac, the city's premium deluxe hotel overlooking the mighty St. Lawrence River. He charged into one of the spacious ballrooms and took a seat, not wishing to miss one moment of the next panel scheduled to discuss French-Canadian migration to the United States in the late 19th century, the so-called Franco-Americans. His own participation on 2 similar panels and the presentation of his highly attended solo lecture were done and behind him. He now planned to spend the remaining days of the event as an attendee, soaking in as much knowledge as possible in order to feed the passion that had turned into his profession for the past 4 decades, and more recently as the oldest member of Denary. Adopted at a young age, Barthélemy's unknown ancestry was the motivation for a prolific career as a professional genealogist. He had traversed a difficult childhood. Hunger was the harshest of the many privations he had suffered during his youth. Food was scarce in post-war orphanages. As an adult, he struggled with peculiar eating habits and preferences. His relationship with food was complicated, and he knew that. Barthélemy munched on the contents of 2 bags of potato chips, regular and barbecue, 1 bitter dark chocolate bar, and a sack of roasted salted peanuts. He liked variety in his snacks, especially when his wife wasn't around to curtail his indulgences. All this was washed down by an ice-cold soda pop, while he listened to the first of various speakers on the raised platform expound on North America's 2 giant neighboring countries. The first lecturer explained that the United States and Canada have many important geographic features and attributes in common. They share the coastlines of 2 oceans, the Appalachian Highlands, 4 of the Great Lakes, the interior plains, the Rocky Mountains, and many rivers. It is not surprising, therefore, that the history of the exploration and subsequent settlement of both of these countries are closely interrelated. The next speaker pointed out that the complete history of the United States or Canada cannot be properly analyzed and understood without reference to the history of the other. Both nations realized its independence from Great Britain by 2 completely different paths. The United States became a free and independent country by a single great revolution and war of independence. Canada, on the other hand, achieved its autonomy in large part by gradual constitutional change and political evolution over many years. After having refused to join the 13 original American colonies in 1775, and then repulsing several invasion attempts by the fledgling independent American nation. Barthélemy sat up straight in his chair as the third panelist took the podium. He was looking forward to hearing what this woman had to say, especially since she was a long-standing friend of his. His attention was interrupted by the vibrating of his phone. A message lit up on the screen, plain and simple. "Andre, drop whatever you are doing and meet me in Montreal. David." Chapter 9. Bienvenue au Canada. Welcome to Canada. Julia and Wade rushed out of the international terminal at the Montreal Trudeau Airport into a cab, giving the driver instructions to navigate directly to the Bibliothèque et Archives nationales du Québec, where André Barthélemy awaited them at the new 33,000 square meter Grande Bibliothèque, located in downtown Montreal. Mid-November weather in the second largest primarily French-speaking city in the world was harsh, but the snow had not yet arrived. It was nice for Julia to breathe in Canadian air once again. Pre-flight boarding time at Washington Dulles International Airport and travel aboard the plane had given Wade ample opportunity to apprise Julia of the situation and send additional missives to Barthélemy, as well as Denary's historian, Hewitt Fothergill, who was based at the University of Sheffield in the UK. The hours Julia and Wade spent together, however, were not all serious. They had discussed Julia's childhood in the beautiful province, La Belle Province. The majority of Quebecers were of French origin, while many other immigrant nationalities had spiced up its history since the arrival of Europeans in the 16th century. Although Julia's parentage went back to French colonists arriving in the 1660s, several of her friends and neighbors growing up traced their lineage to more recent landings. During their cross-border flight, Julia had stated that Canadians were generally proud to be a multicultural nation. Wade had explained that many in his country felt the same about the United States. However, he had pointed out the historical importance of the melting pot assimilation approach to welcoming immigrants to American shores. He had described the melting pot as a metaphor for a heterogeneous society becoming more homogeneous, the different elements melting together into a harmonious whole with a common culture. Historically, the term melting pot was often used to describe the assimilation of immigrants to the USA. The desirability of assimilation and the melting pot model has, he had explained, more recently been reconsidered by modern proponents of multiculturalism, while others continue to argue that cultural assimilation is important to the maintenance of national unity and should be promoted. Julia nodded thoughtfully at the dichotomy of views held by her neighbors to the south, while Wade had recalled the time his grandfather declared, "We Americans are not multicultural. We are multi-heritage. Culture is what we live. Heritage is what we bring." Wade had next asked his Canuck friend about the reputation for Canadians being nice, polite, humble, and modest. She had laughed at that remark, noting that, oddly, in recent years, Canadian media, celebrities, and politicians constantly bragged publicly about these supposed Canadian attributes, ironically negating them in the process by their unabashed rude, immodest, impolite, and conceited braggadocio. Traffic was light as their taxi sped away from the airport towards the city's core. "Everything looks kinda gray, doesn't it?" Wade's stark comment prompted Julia to join him in looking out the cab window into the early evening darkness. "Of course it does. It's almost winter." "Don't worry," she began singing in a small voice. "The sun will come out tomorrow," then gave Wade a look. Yeah, I know," he retorted, then blandly proceeded to complete the melodic verse. "Bet your bottom dollar that tomorrow there'll be sun." Surprised by the improvised songfest, they both laughed out loud, with Wade placing his hand on Julia's knee in friendship. She liked his modest gesture of physical attention, and thus reciprocated by covering his hand with hers, just for a moment. The rest of the ride was spent debating the merits of ice hockey versus baseball. Julia was an unconditional Montreal Canadiens fan, while Wade was a die-hard Yankees supporter. Which was the best franchise, and whose players were the greatest? The Habs, Howie Morenz, Rocket Richard, Jean Béliveau, Jacques Plante, Guy Lafleur? Or the Pinstripes, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Joe DiMaggio, Mickey Mantle, Reggie Jackson? One thing they did agree on: both teams were the greatest in their respective sports, with by far the most Stanley Cup and World Series championships to their credit. Their light banter passed the travel time but ceased upon nearing their destination. Known as the BANQ, the contemporarily styled 5-story National Library and Archives of Quebec building was beautifully clad with U-shaped plates of glass placed horizontally on the copper uprights that run the whole height of the modern building. Upon exiting the cab, both were impressed with its elegant and beautiful nighttime lighting. The splendor of the edifice gave Julia a frisson, and for a nice moment made her feel proud to be a native Montrealer. They entered the Grand Library and made their way to the information desk, where they were told that a man by the name of Monsieur Barthélemy had reserved and now occupied a private research room, known at the BANQ as a study carrel, on the 3rd level. The duo used the escalator to reach the designated floor and approached the study room with excitement. Wade had not seen Barthélemy in some time, and Julia was looking forward to meeting him for the first. Expecting a warm welcome, they opened the door, but were instead greeted by a stern face wearing nose-tip glasses. "David, I think I found something." Chapter 10. According to the early 20th century letter given to Wade by Doris Shelby at the Smithsonian, Abraham Lincoln fathered what was at that time called an illegitimate child, or baby born out of wedlock. The social stigma attached to such a birth had surely prompted the immediate intervention of Lincoln's stepmother, who had whisked away the child to a young immigrant Irish couple living in New Salem. Lincoln was unaware of his stepmother's actions, thinking the baby and mother both died during childbirth. The letter concludes by stating that the adoptive parents soon left New Salem for Chicago, where the child was baptized and given the name Patrick Donovan. The Donovan family then left the United States a few weeks later for the British colonial city of Montreal in the future province of Quebec, then known as Lower Canada. Wade had sent an e-version of Shelby's letter to both Julia and Barthélemy, which allowed the latter to immediately access his network of contacts to help him find out what happened to the young family once they reached Montreal. Denary's veteran genealogist was then able to conduct physical research at the BANQ and locate new information, which he now was anxious to share with his friend and team leader. "André Barthélemy, please meet Julia Cartier." Julia stepped forward and shook the round man's fleshy hand. "Bonjour, monsieur." He did not rise. Cartier. Is that for the gem merchant or the discoverer?" "The famous explorer, of course." Julia responded untruthfully but enthusiastically, deciding it appropriate to answer this oft-asked question by selecting Canada's early European explorer as the fictitious source of her surname. French adventurer Jacques Cartier gave Canada its name and was the first to visit the Iroquois settlement of Hochelaga in 1535, now present-day Montreal. Wade had often heard this question posed to Julia, as well as her palette of different responses. He was amused by this evening's answer. "Any problems getting here, André?" No, très facile, very easy. I simply embarked a train from one downtown to the other. 90 minutes, no more." Wade had known that Barthélemy was in Canada via his Denary tracking device that allowed him to locate his group members at all times. He was not surprised that his French genealogist was already laboring at the task. He did not so much embrace a challenge as tackle it. "Okay," Wade said, sitting down with Julia at the rectangular table which took up most of the stuffy, windowless research room. "What have you got for me, André?" "I have located the whereabouts of our Donovan family here in Montreal, starting in the mid-1830s, as related by the letter you sent me. It appears that the family and their adoptive son lived in this city for the Well, almost the next 3 decades. Did he stay in Montreal his whole life? Did he get married and have children? That, mademoiselle, is what we now need to find. Barthélemy placed his hand upon a large stack of books lined up on a black metal trolley stationed next to him. Julia's eyes widened. What? We need to sift through all those volumes? I am afraid so, mademoiselle. But all this stuff, it is not online? Not all, responded the Frenchman with a deep sigh. Some has been digitized, but not everything in this library. Not yet, anyway. All right, then, Wade said encouragingly. Let's get started. For the next 2 hours, the triumvirate searched the materials Barthélemy had gathered with the help of the bibliothèque staff. Book after book, volume after volume, tome after tome, pamphlet after pamphlet were perused, then shared when any pertinent info regarding the Montreal Donovans was identified. Various records for the targeted years, including census, tax, voting, real estate, education, marriage, birth, and death records, were diligently examined without any meaningful results. It was almost 10 p.m. and Julia was tired. She was hungry, too. Her last meal had consisted of airport food. Barthélemy must have been reading her mind because she spotted him extracting a muffin from one of his jacket side pockets. Hey, Julia reacted, warning him. You are not allowed to eat in here, monsieur. It is against the rules. She pointed at a placard in French, pinned to the wall, titled Règlement. Barthélemy turned to read the placard. While examining it, he proceeded to devour the baked treat in seconds. Call la police, mademoiselle, call la police! The moon-faced Frenchman shouted, erupting into a jolly Santa Claus laugh. Julia was despondent. Wade, sensing his friend had given it her all, placed his hand on her forearm and said, Julia, it's getting late. Why don't you leave and go visit your parents? They must be waiting for you. She nodded. Chapter 10, Part 2. Go eat a good home-cooked meal and get a solid night's sleep in your old room. I'm sure your parents haven't changed a thing. He chuckled at the comment, and so did she. Okay, David, but what about you? Don't worry. I need to stay here for a while, and then I'll find a place to sleep. Don't worry. She looked straight into his blue eyes and smiled. Wade took Julia by the hand and led her to the door. Before exiting the room, she said goodnight to Barthélemy, who grunted some kind of response without breaking his fixed gaze and concentration on several loose documents he was examining. Julia called for a taxi and traveled off the island of Montreal across the famous bridge that bears her family name to the South Shore town in which she grew up and where her parents still lived. They were looking forward to their daughter's visit and sleepover. Her bedroom was, indeed, left unaltered since her teenage years, still decorated with her best and favorite crafts. Julia still loved crafting. Meanwhile, back at the BANQ, Wade sent his assistant, Jenny, a text. She was working late at the New York office trying to locate online data relevant to her boss's present search efforts. He asked her to book the 2 best hotel rooms available, anywhere in the city's center. Frustrated by the lack of results, Wade proposed a new strategy. Andre, let's put all this aside temporarily and start looking at Montreal's Irish family histories. Maybe we can locate something there. Barthélemy agreed. The 2 men left the cramped space of the uninspired research room and climbed a flight of stairs. They spent the next 2 hours navigating the plenitude of symmetrically aligned parallel rows of bookshelves, gathering and reviewing the myriad of materials about 19th century Irish families living in Montreal. They did not return to their confined and sterile work area, instead preferring to remain where the primary materials were and review any pertinent documents immediately upon locating them. Wade examined the many relevant books in search of something, anything, that would advance the narrative. Standing, with his nose firmly planted in the innards of a large dusty tome, he suddenly became uneasy. His eyes abandoned the word hunt. His most delicate of senses took over. He heard soft shuffling, then low regular breathing. His acute hearing caught every sound wave, amplified beyond normality. He felt a presence nearby, a foreign presence, at his back. Someone looking at him, staring with no intention of being seen. He slowly lifted his eyes from the page without changing the inclination of his head, then turned to identify the onlooker. He noticed a shadow bolt from a proximate perpendicular alcove. Curious, he advanced towards the area and the person spying on him. Rounding the aisle into the next, he was unable to catch a glimpse of his observer. He walked up and down a few more rows of bookshelves, then stopped, concluding that the watcher was now long gone. He did not feel the need to expand or resume searching the repository for the unidentified spectator. He nevertheless thought the brief episode odd, very odd indeed. Rejoining his academic friend, Wade was reminded by Barthélemy that the mass migration of over 1 million impoverished Irish to North America during the mid-19th century left no East Coast city unchanged. Montreal had welcomed tens of thousands of these folks, escaping the displacement, famine, and disease in the old country. Montreal's Irish community had quickly grown and flourished throughout the city, and especially in their own concentrated ethnic neighborhoods. Together, he and the Frenchman plunged into one particular section at the bottom of a shelf that looked promising. Their combined efforts, however, were again fruitless and discouraging. Showing no signs of fatigue or discouragement, Barthélemy soldiered on, determined to help shed more light on the life of Patrick Donovan. At least this boy had been spared the workhouse, he said to himself. Having faced the trials and tribulations of mid-20th century orphanages, Barthélemy could only imagine the hardships one encountered in these institutions during the mid-1800s. As the time approached the midnight hour, a library attendant informed Barthélemy that the facility would soon be closing. Wade could not understand the foreign words that made up their short conversation, but he could grasp the gist of it. Denary's doyen finished one last paragraph, then lifted his eyes towards Wade, ready to leave. His young boss, however, did not reciprocate. "André! André!" He beckoned his old mentor in a loud whisper. "Come here!" Barthélemy joined him with regained vigor, sensing something interesting had been found. Wade pointed at a specific paragraph in the book he was holding. Leaning forward, Barthélemy read the text as Wade reread the same. Finishing simultaneously, they smiled, then re-examined the paragraph again. Wade lifted his head and tapped a finger on the section in question with satisfaction at this key finding. In 1863, Patrick Donovan had left Montreal for the United States. Abraham Lincoln's son had gone south and fought in the American Civil War. Chapter 11. David Wade was not big on sleep. He always managed to get the minimum amount of winks required to function, but little else. He had settled into his accommodations at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel around 1 a.m., took a shower, then ordered room service for some pasta and 2 bottles of cold beer, with a chilled glass covered in ice. Still adrenaline primed, he knew he would not be able to slumber for a while, so he put on comfortable clothes and spread out his working materials and devices on a triangular table, which he dragged next to the large floor-to-ceiling window overlooking downtown Montreal and its lovely mountain, Mount Royal. The mountain peak was crowned by a huge illuminated cross, symbolizing the city's Catholic heritage. Locally known as the Queen E, Wade's deluxe five-star hotel was the scene for the Beatles' John Lennon and his wife Yoko Ono's celebrated 1969 bed-in, calling on the world to give peace a chance as the Vietnam War raged. Jenny had booked the newly renovated Lennon-Ono suite for her boss, knowing he would appreciate the experience. The post-midnight hour, Montreal time, was ideal for Wade to make two calls, one to the American West Coast and another to Europe. Wade flipped open his laptop and first video called Denary's young West Coast scientific virtuoso, James Felix. "Yo!" The distant bellowing of a young man's voice acknowledged reception of the call. "Hi, Jim." Wade stared at a blank screen. No response. "Jim?" A familiar face slid onto the screen sporting a rally cap. "Hey, super dude, greetings!" Video conversations with James were eclectic experiences. A great collector and lover of the last century's recorded music, Muddy Waters could be heard in the background. Recent calls had showcased the talents of Cole Porter, the Rolling Stones, Elton John, Whitney Houston, and Megadeth. "I can hear some scratches, Jim. Is that Muddy Waters on vinyl?" "Sure is, amigo. Vintage format for the ultimate vintage sound." Wade couldn't understand the movement back to vinyl. It made no sense to him at all. He was an all-digital audiophile. "Hey, Jim, take a look." Wade rotated his laptop 360 to show off the various relics decorating the customized room. "I'm in the Lennon-Ono suite in Montreal." James' jaw dropped. He instantly knew what Wade was referring to and put both hands onto his head, exclaiming, "I'm freaking out here." The Beatles were like gods to James. Wade let his team's genius enjoy the view, then abruptly turned to business. "Jim, I need an advanced course on DNA." Although Wade regularly used cutting-edge deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, results in his genealogical work, he wished to know more about the up-to-date science involved. Scientifically, what's new? Also, break down the different extraction methods, contamination risks, degradation events, preservation techniques, sequencing options, genetic inheritance principles, etc., and etc. Oh, and I need the latest on cryogenics. "No problemo, mighty one. We'll process and send to you pronto." "Thanks," Wade chuckled. "By the way, got any new toys for me?" As Denary's inventor, James built gadgets for Wade on demand, but sometimes surprised his boss with contraptions that might be useful. "Sure do, Dave." Bending down, James disappeared from the screen. He reoccupied the frame holding a black plastic apparatus slightly bigger than a round glass coaster. "What's that?" Wade was always psyched for James's new gear. "It's a drone, but not just any kind of drone. It's a JF original custom made for DW. Just like you want these things." James gave Wade a corner of a smile and nodded confidently. The machine he constructed for his boss had a built-in antenna allowing for higher bandwidth video than standard commercial models. "Wonderful," Wade reacted with reserved enthusiasm. "Where are the wings?" James pressed on a side button and 4 identical appendages unfolded and expanded into place using cutting-edge origami design. "Nice," Wade said, impressed. "Very nice." "The light structural frame and body was 3D printed. I just finished writing and testing the software program and app. I'll share them with you in the usual manner and, ship this machine off first thing in the AM, David." Where to? Better contact Jen to coordinate. Okay, will do. Before terminating the call, Wade had one last question for James. He knew the young man hero-worshipped great inventors, and Wade liked to test his knowledge. Jim, who is Canada's greatest inventor? That's easy. Assuming a cocky tone. Alexander Graham Bell lived most of his life up there in the Maritimes. Oh, and James Naismith was born in Canada. Who? Asked Wade. What did he invent? Come on, bro. The dude invented the best game ever imagined. James looked at Wade with both hands, uplifted and mouth wide open. Wade shook his head. Basketball, Davy boy, basketball. Wade nodded. Who's the man? Who's the man? James bragged insistently. You're the man, Jim, you're the man, responding levelly as if doing an old comedy routine. The Golden State boy indicated his self-proclaimed #1 status with an upright index finger, then pointed it at Wade in appreciation. Thanks for the most recent moolah, Dave. The transfer was greatly appreciated. Wade gave his whiz kid a thumbs up, then ended the call just as room service arrived with his order. He poured himself a frigid lager and consumed the sustenance on his plate in quick time, then prepared himself for his next on-screen meeting. The day was not yet spent. It was very late in Montreal, but it was early morning in England. Chapter 12. Julia entered the Queen Elizabeth Hotel dining room at 8 o'clock sharp to join the two men she had abandoned the night before. They were already seated and seemingly enjoying their morning constitutional. Hi, Julia. Wade was pleased to see his friend. She was dressed all in black, sensibly heeled ankle boots, sleek low-rise skinny jeans, and a stylish loose-fitting blouse under a cropped-fitted jacket, crowned by tastefully applied makeup, silver stud earrings, and a barrette to keep her long flowing black hair back and out of her big round dark eyes. An image of poise, elegance, and style. She never actually considered modeling because at 5'6", she was just a few inches shy. Julia was quiet, reserved, modest, humble, but very confident and direct, even tactless at times. She was not the most introspective person, the kind who enjoys exploring the understanding of herself. Julia's personality was unlike her parents. Even in her physical appearance, her mother and father disowned her. She didn't look like either one of them. Good morning, mademoiselle. Barthélemy hardly looked up from his plate of scrambled eggs, bacon, and pancakes drenched in Quebec's finest maple syrup. Julia acknowledged the greetings and joined them, but did not order any drink or food, having been well fed by her mother upon waking at her childhood home. The pretty Montrealer was up to date. Wade had sent her a detailed late-night missive announcing his last-minute discovery at the bibliothèque, and asking her if she still wanted to continue on this escapade with him. She had read the message earlier that morning and had responded in the affirmative, thus making plans to meet him for breakfast. She had enjoyed revisiting the halcyon days of her youth and appreciated the brief time spent with her parents. Good, honest, simple folk. Her loving mother had nursed her fatigue and hunger pains the night before, and her father, a prince of a man and skillful driver, had volunteered to deliver her back to the city center and did so on time, despite heavy morning traffic. I've got a limo waiting to take us to the airport, Julia. Will you be joining us, André? No, mademoiselle. I return to Quebec City by train this morning, and then back to La Rochelle tomorrow. I miss my ocean. He smiled and chuckled. And my wife. The grizzled research warrior proceeded to angle his plate, dip his thumb, and sneak a quick lick, making sure he had captured every drop of Quebec's golden sweet liquid. Julia was aghast, and became even more so when he then built himself a maple syrup and avocado sandwich and began to munch on the bizarre assemblage with apparent glee. "Ah!" the Frenchman proclaimed upon swallowing the first bite. "Avocado! Nature's butter!" He winked at the stunned mademoiselle and laughed heartily. The couple left Barthélemy to finish his morning feast and headed for the airdrome. Inside the limousine, Wade looked through the tinted window. "Still looks gray to me." Julia, feigning irritation, poked him in the side. He was trolling, and the soft laughter he offered revealed pleasure with the results. This time of year, Montreal was no longer verdant. Also, most historical buildings in Canada's first metropolis were constructed of a very uniform-looking grey limestone that is almost 500 million years old. This rock is generally referred to in French as pierre grise, Montreal greystone. It was readily and cheaply available near the surface over a large part of the eastern end of the island. Jenny, as usual, had organized every travel detail impeccably. Wade and Julia arrived at their designated terminal with time to spare and proceeded with their light carry-on bags towards the security, customs, and immigration areas to dispense with the usual formalities. Encountering almost no delays, they then walked briskly towards Gate 34 and settled in at the VIP lounge for business-class travelers. "I think I'll do some duty-free browsing, David." Wade nodded at her with a smile and watched her slink away with aplomb. Arriving early had its advantages. He jump-started his tablet and began reviewing the detailed notes transmitted to him by Denary's British historian, as requested during their video conversation of the night before. Wade had asked Hewitt Fothergill to send him info on Great Britain and its colonies, including Canada, during the years of the American Civil War. Knowing there would most likely be a mountain of data, Wade specifically instructed Hewitt to perform a triage and forward only what was necessary. The short version, Hewitt, not the Ken Burns version. Wade's concerns were specific. How did the American Civil War affect its northern neighbor? Which side did the British Empire and Canada, British North America, support during the conflict? And finally, why did Canadians fight in that war? Chapter 13. In April 1861, troops of the new Confederate States of America opened fire on Union-occupied Fort Sumter and launched a bloody 4-year war that killed at least 620,000 men, including thousands of Canadians who fought in the war. In accordance with Britain's foreign policy towards the war, Canada was officially neutral. This, however, did not prevent approximately 50,000 Canadian-born soldiers from serving in both armies. 4 Canadians attained the rank of Brigadier General, and 29 were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Throughout the war, Canadian public opinion was divided for various reasons, including religion, language, culture, economic class, and moral background. The Civil War was the culmination of the reciprocal, sometimes parallel, but often intertwining influence of both the United States and Canada on each other's historical, territorial, political, economic, and social development. Following the war, 2 new nations emerged. Wow, Wade thought, that's good writing. Hewitt's notes were spot on. They rapidly gave his boss what he wanted, an understanding of the conflict from a continental perspective, not just an internal American viewpoint. As to why so many Canadians joined the ranks, Hewitt explained the phenomenon thus. Many of the Canadian-born soldiers lived and worked in the USA when the war broke out. These men naturally joined their local community regiment, Northern Union Blue or Southern Confederate Gray. Some joined out of conviction for their side's beliefs, principles, and cause. while others joined for the money, to get away from tough family situations, or simply in the hopes of experiencing something new, an adventure. Most of the young Canadian men, and a few young women disguised as men, who actually left Canadian territory and traveled to American soil, joined the Union military, Abraham Lincoln's army. They did so for a multitude of different reasons, including anti-slavery convictions, escaping personal problems, regular meals and a bed, 3 hots and a cot, excitement, but most of all, employment. Civil War armies, mainly in the North, paid well, and signing bonuses, especially later in the war when soldiers were needed, were substantial. As the war dragged on and high casualties took their toll, the Federal Army unofficially sent recruiters to Canada to sign up men with the enticement of guaranteed money up front. Finally, some escaped black slaves that had reached and settled in Canada via the Underground Railroad returned to the United States during the war to enlist in the newly formed African American regiments known as the United States Colored Troops, USCT. Wade wondered which of these many reasons had enticed Patrick Donovan to leave his family, home, and country to freely engage in this bloody foreign conflict. The American sleuth then turned to the DNA and cryogenics information Denary's scientist had sent him. James Felix always prepared 2 research versions for his superior. The first, fully detailed and complete, the other, short and sweet. Wade chose to read the crib notes, knowing he could attack the scholarly version later on the airplane. Julia reappeared in the waiting lounge with a bottle of juice in hand and was about to sit when she suddenly stopped and listened to a generic male voice make an announcement regarding their flight through the ceiling speakers. A message in Canada's 2 official languages. Wade ignored the first announcement in French, but clearly heard the second. Your attention, please. Business class passengers may now board Flight 299 to Philadelphia. Chapter 14. Philadelphia International Airport is one of the busiest in the world and among the fastest growing in the United States. It is the largest airport in the state of Pennsylvania and the multi-state Delaware River Valley region. Although not the capital of the Keystone State, Philadelphia is its largest city and one of the most populous in the country, and was once a citadel of Union support and industry during the war between the states. Outside the main international terminal purred a pink Chevy Vette, awaiting the 2 travelers from the Great White North. Julia had arranged for her deluxe rental to be moved from Washington's airport to this terminal's valet parking area. Wade did not let the exterior shine of the vehicle distract him this time. He rapidly slid onto the passenger seat and told Julia their destination. The city of brotherly love is well known for many things, including Philly cheesesteaks, several top-notch sports teams, the Ivy League University of Pennsylvania, founded by Benjamin Franklin, Revolutionary War historic sites, and the Laurel Hill Cemetery. Established in 1836 and designated a National Historic Landmark, few American graveyards have received this distinction. Located in Philadelphia's East Falls section, the 74-acre cemetery overlooks the Schuylkill River and contains more than 33,000 monuments and 11,000 family lots. During the war to save the Union, Laurel Hill became the final resting place of hundreds of military figures, including 42 Civil War generals. Situated in Fairmount Park, this burial ground is located not far from a Civil War-era mansion recently converted into the Philadelphia Civil War Library. The repository houses an extensive catalog of documents, photos, artifacts, as well as a complete database of Civil War regimental histories for Pennsylvania, yet to be fully published online. Wade had often been to Philadelphia, but this was Julia's first visit. The drive from the airport to the library brought them through the city streets and colorful neighborhoods, and past many Civil War outdoor sculptures, including the grandiose Smith Memorial Arch, a monument to Pennsylvania's naval and military heroes of the war. Guided by Wade's smartphone, Julia followed the satellite instructions dutifully towards a beautiful riverside green space, the city's first and largest municipal park, built in the early 1800s. As the site of the 1876 Centennial Exposition and the first zoo in the United States, the Philadelphia Zoo, Fairmount Park was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. The Schuylkill River runs through the center of the park. Its sites include the Fairmount Water Works, Boathouse Row, Shofuso Japanese House and Garden, Memorial Hall, Smith Memorial Playground and Playhouse, Centennial Arboretum, Horticulture Center, recreational centers, reservoirs, outdoor statues, sculptures, and other pieces of public art. The park also contains several historic houses, including the old mansion that had been transformed into a historic storehouse of Civil War data treasures, Julia and Wade's destination. The great Victorian mansion that they approached exemplified the style, elegance, and opulence of the grand houses built during the Age of Empire. Now a 3-story gabled historic library open to the public, it had once belonged to one of the city's wealthiest families. Exiting the cozy interior of their ride, the young couple were rudely welcomed to the splendid grounds by a bitterly cold wind that penetrated layers of clothing to ice-kiss their dormant bones. They moved swiftly towards the steps of the full-width front porch. Wade shortened his stride to match Julia's, so as not to ungallantly outdistance her. They did not knock or ring, instead obeying the gilded plaque positioned on the door to enter. Once inside and completely shielded from the frigid airstream, they stood for a moment in silence, realizing that they were perhaps the only patrons on the premises. They did not yet dare move into the grand domed entrance hall filled with exceptional period furnishings. The silence was finally splintered by the distant sound of footwear upon wooden flooring. Wade was the first to notice. The steps were slow and uneven. The syncopated rhythm neared, grew louder and more intriguing. The owner of this peculiar stride finally entered the hall and moved straight towards them down the wide and spacious hallway with determination. But by far, his most striking physical feature was his left arm. It was missing. His hair was in an apparent state of retreat, with the rest forming a horseshoe at the back of his head. He sported a thick brown mustache with a few traces of invading silver specks. His posture was good, despite his obvious physical challenges. He appeared to be in his 50s, albeit at the top end of the scale. Julia watched him approach with analytical caution. The one-armed man hobbled, suggesting that his right leg had met the same fate as his left arm. Wade's first impression was that this fellow looked like the many Civil War soldiers in old photos, victims of the wartime bone cutters. Then, he more realistically guessed him to be a casualty of recent American wars in Asia or the Middle East. Arriving face to face with the young couple, the man extended his one and only arm and smiled. "Hello, my name is Edward Browning. Welcome." Chapter 15. The New York City accent was obvious, glaringly obvious. Wade was not an expert on Philadelphia accents, but he sure could recognize the many from New York, and this was one. "Before you ask," the man said loudly and assuredly, "no, I am not a veteran amputee. I lost my limbs in a silly accident. With that out of the way, the man asked how he could be of service. "Well," Wade said, finally voicing his first words since entering the mansion, "I wish to research the activities and fate of a Canadian man who joined a Pennsylvania regiment, a Union regiment." The man uttered, looking up and down Julia's svelte frame. "Yeah, I guess I can help you with that. But for the record, although some border states fielded regiments on both sides, Pennsylvania formed only Union regiments." He turned and began moving away, then finally declared, "Follow me." They trailed their host into a vast chamber with a high ceiling, most likely the mansion's posh dining room of days gone by. The walls were occupied by wooden bookshelves and metal filing cabinets. The 5 computer terminals contrasted oddly with the 19th century architecture. Arriving at the station with a Civil War buff mousepad, the man sat with some difficulty and began questioning his guests with a gravelly voice. "Do you have a name for the soldier?" Wade quickly answered the question and proceeded to answer many others in rapid succession. Humming innocently to himself, the man worked his keyboard and shuffled a few books with remarkable dexterity. Noticing that his guests were impressed with his one-handed prowess, he declared, "I'm not a bad golfer, too. 20 handicap." Julia smiled, enjoying the spunk in the man's voice and apparent positive outlook on life. Wade didn't pause to display a reaction to the comment, instead continuing to peruse a heavy tome he held and caressed with respect. "Can I help in any way, Mr. Browning?" Julia asked. "Your mere lovely presence is of great value to my blood circulation, miss." He looked up at her and smiled. Julia giggled at the compliment. "Yes, I could use you on this terminal, searching regimental rosters and reports." He indicated which computer he was offering her with a movement of his head. Julia nodded and got to work. "Oh, and by the way, miss, my father's name is Mr. Browning. Call me Edward." This exchange occurred without the participation of Wade, who had moved on to a different bookcase to continue searching through various materials. Browning suddenly stopped his humming and typing, then turned to Wade. "This Patrick Donovan fellow, do you have anything else on him?" Wade crossed the room back towards Julia and their host. "No, I've told you everything we have, everything we've found so far." "As you know," Browning added, "thousands of Canadian boys joined Northern regiments, including Pennsylvania. A young man like Donovan of Irish heritage most likely joined our state's Irish brigades." He nodded to himself, then announced, "Let's focus on those regiments." Another hour passed without results. Wade appreciated the carte blanche research access given to him, but he was not pleased with the results so far. With Wade's coaxing, Julia had abandoned her terminal and stood alongside him as he perused the inner contents of several filing cabinets, passing along selected documents to his friend for her to review. She found it difficult, however, to read the scrawl. The challenging 19th century handwriting styles she encountered were daunting. Chapter 15, Part 2. She struggled, as all researchers generally do, with the deciphering of a multitude of handwritten military papers. Despite this, she liked working in tandem with Wade, and also did not mind putting some distance between herself and their host's irritating humming, which had abruptly transformed itself into annoying, happy whistling. Their amiable host seemed to have a lot of the child in him. Browning abruptly ceased tooting and stood. "Would you like some coffee?" "No thanks, I never do," replied Wade. Julia shook her head. She declined most offers of coffee, for, As a fussy aficionado of the beverage, she only enjoyed the most high-end brands and certain concoctions brewed in recognized coffee shops. She was a bit of a coffee snob. "Are you sure?" Browning asked again. "I make a killer pot." He waited for his guests to change their answers, but they didn't. He shrugged and headed to another room, returning minutes later holding a Civil War nut mug filled with steaming brew. He repositioned himself in front of his screen and drank his beverage, seemingly doing little. He just sat there whistling Dixie. A few minutes and gulps later, reanimated, he looked directly at Wade. "Is this Donovan kid a relation of yours?" "No," answered Wade, leaving it at that. Julia offered more. "He's trying to solve a mystery." "A mystery?" Browning snickered. "What are you?" looking back at Wade. "Some kind of Sherlock Holmes?" No reaction. "Hercule Poirot?" Still no reaction. "Miss Marple?" He laughed. Wade ignored the jibes, thinking the man's choice of literary detectives obviously dated him. "No," Wade finally answered. "I'm just a curious guy and lover of history." "Ah." Browning turned and looked back towards his terminal. "Yeah, we get a lot of those in here." Julia took a few steps towards him and asked, "Are you a professional researcher, professor, or curator of this library?" Eyes fixed to his screen, Browning ceased his humming and answered blandly, "No, I'm just a volunteer. I'm a retired civil servant and founding president of a small but very active Civil War roundtable in the burbs." He pointed to a nearby framed photo of himself dressed as a Union officer with his empty sleeve pinned to his chest. "And I'm a seasoned reenactor." He smiled proudly, then chuckled while glancing at his missing arm. "I sure do add some realism and authenticity to our reenactment events," laughing and coughing as he ended his sentence. Pointing to another image, he explained that he was born in Montana, grew up in New York City, and moved to work in Philadelphia. Taking interest, Julia spotted another photo of him in uniform standing next to a woman wearing a T-shirt with the frontal inscription, "Lady Civil War Reenactor, I look hot in a hoop skirt." "Is your wife a reenactor too?" "I'm not married." He quit his keyboard and turned to her. "Never have been." He chuckled again. "I guess you can say that I'm married to the cause." He then glared at Julia with his best lady killer grin. "Unless you're single, Ms. Cartier, and looking for a gallant army officer to wed." They both laughed at his proposal, ending the exchange. Julia returned to Wade's side to continue her work. Suddenly, his head jolted back. "I've got it!" he exclaimed. "I found it!" His fellow researchers gave him their complete attention. "I found Patrick Donovan's regiment." Chapter 16. Wade reacted oddly to old books, documents, and artifacts. When searching a box, cabinet, or container for historical finds, he loved the feel and smell of the items so much that he sometimes wished he could crawl inside and close the lid. This morning's find was revelatory. On June 1st, 1863, exactly 6 months after his father, the president, issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Patrick Donovan joined the 69th Pennsylvania Irish Volunteer Infantry Regiment. The infantry in the war comprised foot soldiers who fought primarily with small arms and carried the brunt of the fighting on battlefields. Initially recruited from Philadelphia Irish militia companies of the Pennsylvania Militia, the 69th Regiment was mustered into service during the first summer of the war in 1861. Part of the famed Philadelphia Brigade, it fought with the Army of the Potomac in the Eastern Theater and engaged in several major battles leading up to June 1863. Union regiments were permitted to dwindle due to battle casualties, sickness, and desertions, without replacements. A typical regiment was formed with 1,000 men but quickly decreased as the war continued, until the personnel numbers became so low that the unit was merged with another or disbanded. The Union Army was allowed to continually muster new regiments at the demands of state governors who wanted to reward political patronage by providing supporters with regimental commands. Although replacements were not the norm for replenishing existing Union regiments, exceptions were made. According to the information uncovered at the library, this is how Patrick Donovan joined the 69th at the start of the war's third summer. As to why an unmarried 27-year-old man would leave Canada and travel south to Pennsylvania to join an Irish regiment, certain clues found at the library helped Wade piece together a plausible story. During this research session, the trio found evidence that other Montreal Irish boys had earlier joined the regiment. Patrick Donovan was most likely aware of their escapades by way of letters sent back to their Montreal families, then disseminated throughout the Irish community. Also, by 1863, large amounts of money offered to fresh enlistees most likely tempted Patrick. Wade's research revealed that the Donovan family lived as part of Montreal's poor working class. Patrick's adoptive father labored in a factory, and Patrick was doing the same until he left the city. The majority of Union soldiers during the Civil War served as volunteers. Still, the Army needed more fighting men and, in March 1863, a national draft with state quotas was put in place. Under the law, the policies of substitution and commutation were controversial practices that allowed drafted citizens to opt out of service by either furnishing a suitable substitute to take the place of the draftee or paying a penalty of $300 to the federal government. Under the law, draftees could thus avoid service if they paid someone to take their place. The amount offered to potential replacements, along with a signing bonus and regular monthly pay, was very tempting for poor young men willing to risk their well-being for cash. The practice of hiring replacements was a major point of contention among the general public and led directly to the slogan, "Rich man's war, poor man's fight." All the data unearthed by Wade thus far suggested that Patrick Donovan was one of those poor men who would do the fighting. For money, a taste of excitement and adventure, and perhaps, being his father's son, a genuine belief that slavery was wrong. After spending a few weeks in Philadelphia training, Donovan traveled with 3 other men to join up with the 69th on the eve of the regiment's next great battle. Wade now resolved to visit that famous battlefield. He thanked Browning for his time and efforts, made a substantial donation to the library's Scholarly Digitization Fund, and left the site and park with Julia reliably in command of the vet. "Where to now, David?" "West, Julia. Drive west to Gettysburg." Chapter 17. Gettysburg was the 3-day pivotal battle of the Civil War. Located in central Pennsylvania, Gettysburg National Military Park is the grandest of all North American military parks. When visiting the massive park as a youngster with his grandfather, preteen Wade had declared the attraction to be the Disneyland of historic sites. Contested during the first 3 days of July 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg altered the course of the war and created a shift in momentum that eventually led to the downfall of the Confederacy. While traveling the beautiful countryside of rural Pennsylvania, Julia reflected and marveled at the many interesting things she encountered while in the company of her friend. "Every time I'm with you, David, I seem to enter or escape to another world." Wade turned to her, waiting for more. "First it was the Italian Proto-Renaissance, then the English Tudor world, and now the American Civil War." Wade chuckled. "It's what I do, Julia, and I'm always happy when you're along for the ride. Or perhaps I should say, behind the wheel." "Before today," Julia continued, "I knew almost nothing about this war, except for two of its great writers, Walt Whitman and Louisa May Alcott." Wade knew of Alcott's famous novel, Little Women, but he was less certain about Whitman. "Isn't Whitman the guy that wrote about the leaves and the grass?" "Yes," Julia laughed. "I love his book of poetry, Leaves of Grass. And he wrote a renowned elegy after the death of Lincoln." She abruptly assumed a different voice with lower pitch and began reciting, "O Captain, my Captain." Amused, Wade was pleased Julia was enjoying herself, and he took some consolation that a few beautiful things had indeed come out of that horrendous war. Wade now indicated the wish to review his notes before arriving at the battlefield. Julia yielded, redirecting her full attention to the road ahead. An experienced speed reader, Wade devoured the data in no time, but in doing so, realized that he had forgotten to copy an important dispatch regarding troop movements. He called Edward Browning and asked him to scan the document in question and send it to him. "No problem, Mr. Wade. My pleasure." Wade thanked him for his kindness. "Oh, your friend just left. It was nice meeting her, a nice lady." "What lady?" Wade asked, intrigued. "Your friend, you know, a gray-haired lady. She came here just minutes after you left." "What was her name?" Wade inquired with concern. "Oh, yeah, I didn't catch her name, but she told me that you were all scheduled to meet here at the library, but she got caught in traffic and arrived late." Browning waited for Wade to react, but he didn't. "I told her you and Ms. Cartier had just departed for Gettysburg. She was disappointed that she missed you, but asked me about what we had done, and I gladly told her the results of our research. And I gave her a copy of the same documents I gave to you." Again, Wade did not speak. "Anyway, she thanked me and left, just moments ago. I liked the lady and was happy to meet her. She was nice. So, call me anytime, Mr. Wade, if you need more help. I am, sir, your most obedient servant. And again, good luck." Wade repeated his appreciation and closed the call. He sat still, motionless. Who was that gray-haired lady? Chapter 18. The autumn day dropped quickly into night. The pink Corvette rolled into the once sleepy, now touristic town of Gettysburg. The couple had not eaten a complete meal since breakfast. They checked into the aptly named Gettysburg Hotel and repaired to their individual executive suites. Established in 1797, the historic hotel began as a tavern on what is now known as Lincoln Square, Gettysburg Historic Town Center. During the summer of 1863, the building played witness to one of the most pivotal events in the American Civil War, when Confederate troops swarmed the town on the first day of the battle. Wade decided to hit the fitness room. His mind had been working since morn, and now his body needed a good workout to balance things. Exercise, however, usually stimulated his thought process into review mode, and this time would be no exception. During the 2-hour-plus drive to Gettysburg, he had contacted his office to get confirmation that the Smithsonian's donor had transferred the promised upfront funds to his account. Jenny confirmed the deposit had been duly executed. Wade then instructed his assistant to ask Denary's financial expert, Nancy Burnell, to try and track the source of the bank transfer in the hopes of unmasking the identity of the Smithsonian's donor. Wade's London banking guru responded within the hour that the identity of the transferor was rock-solid incognito, just as the Smithsonian chief, Doris Shelby, had told Wade it would be. By way of habit, Wade grabbed a bucket of ice on his way back to his suite from the gym. His shower was quick, but his grooming was not. Another opportunity for thinking. Before washing, he had plunged 2 bottles of lager into the ice bucket in anticipation of a pre-meal workman's cocktail. He ordered a thin crust pizza from the diner below and opened his laptop. Time to reach out, he mused. Firebird. Hey, girl. Hi, Blondie. The video signal was high quality, and so was the image filling up Wade's screen. The woman was all woman. The epitome of alley cat sexuality and brains in just the right mixture. Although mostly hidden from view, beyond the screen's periphery was a perfect 10, a body that screamed sensuality as well as self-assurance. This young woman was confident in her power to attract and used it when necessary. A true daughter of Eve. It was late in Ireland, well past midnight. The face staring back at Wade, however, did not look tired, but alert and fresh. Firebird's visage was delicate and formidable at the same time. Her features were extraordinary with just the proper balance, but her most exceptional attribute was that flaming hot mane of red hair. Denary's art expert was not an easy woman to gauge, and Wade had long ago stopped trying. He liked her no-nonsense bluntness and honesty. He employed her because she was the best at her job, but tonight he wanted to get personal. I remember you telling me that a part of your Dublin clan branched out to the New World in the 1860s and fought in our big family feud. Good memory, David. Yeah, I recall telling you about that once. Tell me more. Well, 2 of my long-ago family members left our island and sailed to the land of opportunity in 1862. Like many other immigrants, especially the Germans and Irish, upon arrival, they signed up at the docks and were immediately shipped off to the front lines to face the slaughter that was going full force. If I remember correctly, they fought at Gettysburg, right? Yeah, that's right. What regiment? 72nd Pennsylvania Infantry. Wade stared vacant at the screen. There was a pregnant pause. Any particular reason you want to know all this stuff, David? He came back to life. You know me. Talking about things helps clarify, helps identify the pieces to a puzzle. He glanced to his left at the chilled glass of beer awaiting his next sip. Drops of condensation running down its side onto the table. I just needed to look at things through a different lens. Thanks, girl. Anytime, Blondie. Wade finally took a fresh gulp from his neglected beverage as he let the long day's events dissolve like a lozenge in his mind. He leaned his forehead against the cold glass, thinking. Oh, and by the way, he reminded himself, tomorrow is November 19th, the anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Chapter 19. Julia filled her suite's whirlpool bathtub. She put her long black hair up and turned on the massaging jets, programmed the timer, and slipped in. She positioned her body in a way that took full advantage of the soothing propulsion of water onto her skin and muscles. After half an hour, the jets ceased. Her usual exposure to this type of controlled typhoon was 20 minutes, but tonight she felt she needed just a little bit more. She loosened the tap marked hot until her watery realm was sufficiently refreshed. She then added body lotion to the calmed waters and sank neck deep into the warmth. The steam opened her facial pores. It felt good. Her dark eyelashes slowly swept down to veil her eyes. Julia's body relaxed, and so did her mind. Her male companion on this adventure drifted into her thoughts. Their friendship was evolving. Or was it? She felt an attraction, but was it moving both ways? Wade was no doubt a sophisticated ladies' man, but his disciplined discretion and gallantry masked his true intentions, if he had any. Ever since their first meeting months ago, she perceived hints and signals that David Wade was interested in her for perhaps more than friendship. He was good and quick with compliments, and she liked that about him. He even once complimented her nose, the only part of her anatomy that she would change. He had defended the honor of her central facial appendage against her own self-criticism. "What?" he had said. "I love your nose. It's got character." "Character?" she had reacted with indignation. "What do you mean by that? Boxers have noses with character." "No, I mean it's different." "Different? Different? Like a ski slope?" No, it's cute. Oh, never mind." All women were a little obsessed with at least one aspect of their physical appearance. Her nose was her greatest disappointment. Although Julia had never ever been reproached by anyone about her nose, for some reason she did not see it as her strongest feature, especially since she had to look at it every day in the mirror, as she now did, staring at the wide looking glass partially encircling the large tub on 3 sides. Her mind decidedly made up, she nevertheless appreciated her American friend's failed but noble attempt to change her opinion. He, on the other hand, was physically perfect, in her estimation. Handsome in every way a man should be, tall, broad-shouldered, thick blonde hair to complement his piercing baby blues. But by far, what seemed to excite her the most was that brain of his. It never stopped. It turned her on. All her life she had admired and was attracted in various ways to smart people, but her fascination with him was different. His Olympian intellect was overwhelming to her, and, in a very peculiar way, made her feel safe. She continued to dwell on him for a while. Could or would something ever develop between them? That Julia did not know. Scarred by recent bad and painful experiences with men, she had built a fortress around her heart to keep it safe. She was not yet ready to fully explore her feelings. Julia toweled off and enveloped herself in a favorite hooded onesie. Having grabbed a quick bite at the deli across the square with a bottle of red to go, she was now set for some alone time in the company of a full glass and the room's flat screen. She surfed the channels looking for something light, but got pulled in by one of her favorite movies, Blade Runner, already in progress. Having seen the flick many times, she moved on after a few minutes and began scrolling the titles offered by the in-house pay-per-view service. She liked watching films from all eras and wasn't afraid of black and white celluloid. She often escaped to old Hollywood, its classic movies and iconic stars like Cary Grant, Errol Flynn, Katharine Hepburn, and Bette Davis. She continued to search and evaluate her options. Her eyes scanned the many choices, then suddenly focused on one in particular. The title leapt out at her. This was definitely not her kind of movie, but Wade had mentioned it earlier in the afternoon as being, in his humble opinion, one of the best pure battle films ever. No romance or other distractions, he had declared, make this movie great entertainment history. You've got to watch it sometime, Julia. It's based on the best-selling book, Gods and Generals. You will learn a lot, and might even enjoy it. ending his sales pitch with a smile. This evening, Julia resolved to follow his advice and take in the 3-hour motion picture. She propped up her pillows against the 4-post antique-style bed's headboard, took a sip of wine, and pulled the covers up to her neck, then pressed play to watch the epic American war film, Gettysburg. Chapter 20. The new day dawned gray and colder. Looking through his suite's large casement windows onto Lincoln Square, Wade performed his ritual of pre-breakfast exercises. He noticed that the weather had fallen sharply. An erratic, fluting wind, laden with showers, beat about the town as the dead leaves ran riot across the square and along the streets. Colder temperatures would not derange his morning plans, but strong wind gusts and precipitation just might. His clothes were laid out on the couch like objects in a museum. He dressed. Wade's previous evening had been spent in the electronic company of certain Denary members and Jenny, who skillfully managed the New York office in his absence. His pre-midnight exchanges had involved the Asian continent by way of voice text to Denary's authenticator of historical objects, Mariko Shimada, based in Tokyo. He had asked her about the status of known original copies of the Gettysburg Address. Her answer had provided the info he needed. Mr. Wade, there are 5 known copies of the Gettysburg Address handwritten by Abraham Lincoln himself. Lincoln gave his 2 male secretaries the first 2 copies he created. These reside at the Library of Congress. There are at least 3 other copies, also penned by the President, prepared well after the Gettysburg Address was uttered. These latter drafts were written by Lincoln as special requests for charitable purposes. One is usually displayed in the Lincoln bedroom of the White House. Another belongs to the Illinois State Historical Library in Springfield. The 5th and final copy is held by Cornell University. It is the only one of the 5 copies to be privately owned. Wade's post-midnight exchanges were with Denary's archaeologist, Tristan Valkyrie. Wade knew his German digger was at her best as the sun rose in her native land. Although Denary's historian had earlier provided him with a wealth of materials on the 3-day Battle of Gettysburg, Wade had hoped Tristan could give him another perspective, and she did. With input from one of her colleagues, a conflict archaeologist, Wade had received information relaying a different point of view. Conflict archaeology is a subdiscipline within the field focused on intragroup and intergroup conflict. Closely associated with battlefield and military sites archaeology, conflict archaeology deals with cultural, social, technological, and psychological aspects of wars. Unlike battlefield archaeology, it delves deeper into the anthropological study of the conflicts incorporating political and nationalistic motivations and notions of ethnicity and identity rather than the physical manifestations of the battles. Wade had twice read Tristan's viewpoint on the battle, then mentally filed the data he had deemed paramount. He met Julia in the lobby as planned at 7:15 a.m., wearing form-fitting khaki pants and a striped shirt rolled at the sleeves. They entered the hotel dining room and partook in the widespread breakfast buffet. Coffee for Julia and a mixture of fresh juices for Wade to start. Julia followed this opening culinary salvo with cereal and a whole wheat muffin, while Wade opted for 2 eggs over easy and unbuttered brown toasts. All my research points to the fact that Patrick Donovan fought here in July 1863. His unit played a large role in this battle, helping repel a Confederate charge that breached the Union defenses on Cemetery Ridge on July 2nd, the 2nd day of the battle. Julia listened closely, remembering the ridge from the movie she had watched the evening prior. What I want us to focus on this morning is the 3rd and last day of the battle. Julia took one last sip, then went to retrieve her car while Wade charged the meal to his room account. He then put on the protective layers of clothing he had chosen for the morning's excursion, grabbed his haversack, and stepped outside. He was pleased the rain had ceased and the wild winds had died down. As Julia drove up to meet him, his mind, which had been racing in different directions, now settled on one thought. What did Patrick Donovan do during the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg? And what exactly happened to him? Chapter 21. In June of 1863, the war was far from over and far from won. Hostilities broke out in April 1861, shortly after President Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated following the contentious presidential election of November 1860. Fiercely opposed to Lincoln and fearing the violation of their constitutional rights and the eventual abolition of slavery, the Southern slave states declared their secession from the United States to form their own country, the Confederate States of America. Lincoln and the Northern states did not recognize the South's right to secede from the Union. They wished to contain slavery and prevent the institution from expanding to new westward territories. The South advocated for states' rights to maintain and expand slavery. Most of the battles during the early years of the war were fought on Southern soil, but following success in the spring of 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia invaded Pennsylvania and clashed with Union Major General George Meade's Army of the Potomac in and around the town of Gettysburg. Nearly 200,000 men met during the battle, resulting in the largest number of casualties of the entire war. Over 51,000 dead, wounded, captured, or missing. The first 2 days of the battle were hard fought but indecisive. Day 3 would be determinant, and it was the key event of that third day that David Wade wished to investigate. He had visited this battlefield on many occasions at different periods of the year and times of the day. Wade's favorite time was twilight, before sunrise, hours before the tourists invaded the park, and tour guides began their orations. This peaceful morning twilight period would last until sunrise, when the sun's upper crest broke the horizon, as the diffused light became direct sunlight. One early morning, at the crack of dawn, when he was not yet a teenager, he and his grandfather had driven to the starting point of the battle, parked and enjoyed a light breakfast in silence while sitting in the car. The morning sun dramatically rose and cut through the early mist. It was eerie. It was special. It was wonderful. Mystically tranquil. This morning with Julia was different, however. It was frigid and cloudy. Entering the Gettysburg National Military Park situated south of the town, Julia pointed at a road sign for the visitor center. "No, Julia," Wade declared. "Go this way instead. I know this park like the back of my hand." They avoided the Information and Interpretation Center and motored directly onto the paved roads of the battle site. Julia followed Wade's directions onto what seemed to her like an internal park roadway laid out especially for touring the grounds. The steady stream of tourists had not yet begun at this early hour. The road was all theirs, except for the occasional jogger or cyclist performing their morning workout, in spite of the uncertain weather. The narrow one-way tour road was flanked by numerous stelae, vintage cannon, statues, and monuments of all sizes. Street panels indicated when to stop or start audio descriptions and narrations of the battle. Over the years, Wade had purchased many of these pre-recorded battlefield tours, but he would have no need for them today. Julia was fascinated by the scope and magnitude of the park and its myriad of cenotaphs. She hoped to stop and view the most grandiose ones up close, but Wade kept pointing his finger onwards, so Julia kept driving. Wade recounted aloud the time he had been on tour of this section of the park, and a young woman had innocently asked the park ranger, "How did they fight amongst all these stone monuments?" Wade shook his head and chuckled at the memory. Julia was not as amused. Driving along West Confederate Avenue, Wade gestured to stop next to the impressive Virginia Memorial. The duo abandoned their ride and walked along Seminary Ridge towards the huge monument erected atop a granite pedestal as a memorial to the Commonwealth of Virginia's young fighting men. The rock monolith was adorned by a group of bronze figures representing the artillery, infantry, and cavalry of the Confederate Army, and a bronze statue of General Lee on his horse, Traveler. The figures faced a vast, ominous, open grass field and the distant equestrian statue of Union General Meade on Cemetery Ridge. Julia shifted her gaze from the Virginia monument to the field and the faraway horizon. Wade knelt down and opened his haversack. He extracted a scuffed cardboard box and opened it. The box contained the item retrieved by him at the hotel's front desk that very morning. A package expedited by Denary's inventor extraordinaire. Julia gazed at the coal-black object with some confusion. It was no larger than a dessert plate. She watched her partner search for a side lever or switch of some kind until he finally met with success. 4 small arms abruptly jutted forth, equipped with small propellers. She instantly recognized the contraption from images, but had never actually seen one up close. Wade stood, holding the object, and looked at the open field in front of him. "Mr. Wade! Mr. Wade!" They turned towards the shouts and noticed someone moving towards them from the parking area near the monument. "Mr. Wade! Miss Cartier!" The figure's outline became familiar as it approached. Edward Browning was joining them at Gettysburg. Chapter 22. Rajiv Mohandas was Denary's cadet, the youngest member of the team and the only one, as far as his leader knew, who still lived with his mother. Having never left his birth country of India, his young imagination had nonetheless taken him around the world. Rajiv was perhaps somewhat naive about life, but as Wade's computer expert, he was very worldly when it came to all matters high-tech and communications. His days living on Asia's subcontinent were spent constantly perfecting and fine-tuning hardware and software in his bedroom, which he had proudly dubbed the Command Control Center. A product of a torrid Indian and Australian love match, Rajiv hoped to one day buy a bigger house for himself and his mother in Bangalore, and own a professional cricket team that would compete in the Indian Premier League. Rajiv adored David Wade and appreciated the regular stipend and bonus money provided for his services, making him the main contributor to the household exchequer. Wade had quickly become his mentor, older brother, and sometimes replacement father figure. Rajiv's goal was to rapidly execute all tasks requested of him by his boss. Today's job was relatively simple, but required a few custom implementations on Wade's many devices, enabling him to command the movements of a drone equipped with smart sensors and multi-angle cameras. Rajiv had received an app and program from Wade for this purpose, but did not know their origin. He never did. His job was to install things and make them work. "Is that what I think it is?" Browning asked as he took his final steps, stopping next to Julia. "Sure is," she said hesitantly, still perplexed by his sudden appearance. He was wearing a double-breasted frock coat of dark blue cloth similar to the winter outerwear worn by Union officers during the Civil War. Atop his head, he wore a képi, a cap with a dark velvet band around the base and black silk braiding on the crown with a sunken top and squared visor. Attached to his hat was a round white pin imprinted with the slogan, "Everybody loves a Civil War reenactor." "To what do we owe this pleasure, Edward?" Wade greeted the volunteer librarian with measured cordiality. "Well," I did some more research after you both left yesterday and found some interesting stuff about your soldier, Patrick Donovan. I know I could have simply called, but I felt like joining you in the great outdoors, especially today." He looked at them both, wondering if they were aware that today was the anniversary of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. They smiled but said nothing. Browning looked around. "One can never get enough of this park. I hope you don't mind." Julia thought it best to let Wade decide and answer accordingly. She just kept smiling. "Not at all, Edward. Glad to have you along. Now," he looked up at the sky, judging the cloud formations, "what have you found?" Sensing that Wade was worried about the meteorological conditions, Browning assured him that his news could wait and thus encouraged Wade to perform his tasks before the weather turned. Wade agreed and set to synchronizing his handheld device with the drone. Their functional compatibility was announced in seconds on the wide tablet, and Wade began operating the unmanned aerial vehicle, or UAV, via the touchscreen. The delicate machinery started with relatively little sound, a low, soft whirling. The ground-based control features were definitely a big leap ahead of the standard machines Wade had recently piloted. James Felix's multi-rotor aircraft so far did not disappoint. As the object lifted from the ground and moved swiftly above their heads, Julia followed the remote-controlled bird. "What exactly are you looking for, David?" Wade hesitated before answering. He was worried about the wind and rain, hoping for a delay to their imminent and inevitable return. Satisfied with the drone's performance and gaining confidence with its operation, he finally responded to Julia's question. "I want a bird's eye view of Pickett's charge." Chapter 23. When the third day of battle at Gettysburg dawned on July 3, 1863, Confederate forces began preparations on Seminary Ridge for a massive infantry assault on the Union Army's center position. The plan called for the taking of Cemetery Hill and the network of roads it commanded, thus enabling the Confederates to win the day and the battle. The infantry attack was preceded by an intensive artillery bombardment of over 100 cannon aimed to destroy the Union artillery batteries that could defeat the assault and demoralize the Federal infantry. This powerful and well-concentrated cannonade of the Union center was meant to soften up the Union defense and silence its artillery, whose barrage had sown death and destruction. They fired all barrels without pause for several hours. The noise was so loud that many soldiers on both sides suffered acoustic shock and subsequent hearing disabilities. Over the years, motivated by his own auditory problems, Wade had researched the negative and sometimes lethal effects of excessive noise on soldiers of all wars, caused by ordnance discharge, stun grenades, or sound bombs. The specific objective of the assault and visual or target landmark for the attacking force was the copse of trees on Cemetery Ridge. The entire Reb force that stepped off towards the enemy positions consisted of approximately 12,600 men. Although the attack is popularly called a charge, the young men marched deliberately in line to speed up and then charged only when they were within a few hundred yards of the Federals. The charge is named after Major General George Pickett, one of 3 Confederate generals who commanded the massive assault, because his division was ordered to lead the assault. Pickett famously rallied his men for the attack with his cry of, "Up, men, and to your posts, and let no man forget today that you are from old Virginia." At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, under a scorching sun, 9 infantry brigades advanced from the camouflage of a dense line of trees into the clear and over open fields for almost a mile under heavy Union artillery and rifle fire. Although some Confederates were able to reach the Union lines and breach the low stone wall that shielded many of the Federal defenders, they could not maintain their hold and were repulsed with very heavy casualties, a decisive defeat that ended the three-day battle and General Lee's campaign into Pennsylvania. The Army of Northern Virginia retreated the next day, leaving Gettysburg for Virginia. Even though the war lasted almost another 2 years, the South launched few offensive operations during that time, none of them near the scale of the Gettysburg campaign. The futility of Pickett's charge was a colossal mistake from which the Southern war effort never fully recovered militarily or psychologically. The farthest point reached by the attack is known as the high water mark of the Confederacy, referring to the South's best chance of achieving victory in the war. And it was to this location that Wade piloted his aerial vehicle. The trio leaned into the tablet screen to view the UAV's panoramic view of the battlefield. They were enthralled by the quality of the images. Wade directed his drone across the grassy field towards the copse or clump of trees and a bend in the stone wall known as the angle that marks the only place where the charge was able to breach the Union lines. This gap in the Federal line was hastily closed with fierce close proximity fighting, resulting in Confederate soldiers who had breached it being quickly captured or killed. Monuments at the high water mark included the high water mark of the Rebellion Monument and the 72nd Pennsylvania Infantry Monument, the location of Firebird's ancestors during the charge. As the UAV hovered over the focal point of the assault, Wade indicated to his companions the location of the 69th Pennsylvania Regiment Monument. The 69th Infantry, heavily engaged in hand-to-hand combat, was the only bluecoat regiment not to withdraw from defending the stone wall in front of the copse of trees during the charge. The regiment thus played a key role defending against Pickett's charge, resulting in enormous casualties for the Irish unit. Many good men were lost, including Abraham Lincoln's son, Patrick Donovan. Chapter 24. Walking the open field of Pickett's charge towards the Union line, Wade continued to skillfully operate his UAV so that he could fully appreciate the circumstances in which Patrick Donovan and his regiment were in during the assault and at the moment when the young man was struck down. He knew that Lincoln's son had died here, but did not know how. They halted. Julia shifted her feet to find better grip on the bumpy terrain. She looked at Browning and asked him what he knew about Donovan's demise. "I called a friend of mine who works at the National Archives in D.C. He paused, lifting his collar against the frigid air. He pulled out Patrick's military file. Some of them have a photo, but sadly, this one didn't. Wade did not show it, but he was disappointed in hearing this. A photograph would have been great. Civil War military files often contained a tintype image of a soldier with his musket and courage on display. Yeah, so... Browning cleared his throat. Patrick was severely wounded during the climax of this charge. Musket ball at close range? Wade asked. No, Browning answered, shaking his head. No, he died of a bayonet wound. What? Are you sure? Wade asked incredulously. Browning nodded. That's amazing, Wade exclaimed. Julia was confused. Why is that so incredible? Didn't many soldiers die that way back then? Actually, no, Ms. Cartier. Browning decided to take it upon himself to explain, leaving Wade to concentrate on operating the drone. Although Civil War rifles were designed for and equipped with bayonets, they were rarely used effectively. Guns had evolved since the smoothbore muskets of the American Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars of generations past. Civil War rifles, were technologically superior and much more accurate, thereby limiting extremely close encounters with the enemy. Hand-to-hand combat was thus relatively rare, although it did occur at the zenith of this particular assault. Julia asked Browning if Donovan had died on the battlefield, or later in a field hospital. It appears that Patrick was killed where he fought. He was never treated as a wounded soldier. The records only describe his fatal wound. Therefore, we must assume he died where he fell. Hearing all this new information prompted Wade to redirect his drone back to the high water mark and the location where Donovan most probably died. He lowered the flying machine and zoomed in on the regimental monument, then scanned the immediate area. "Wait!" Browning shouted and pointed to the tablet screen. "Go back! Back!" Wade obeyed. "There! There!" Pointing to a figure standing next to the stone obelisk. Wade focused in further. "That's her!" Browning yelled. "Who?" Julia shouted back. "The lady!" Browning cried with delight while putting his hand on Wade's shoulder. Julia and Wade waited for an explanation. "She's the person who came to see me yesterday after you left. The woman asking all the questions." Browning looked back at the screen and pointed again. "That's the gray-haired lady!" Chapter 25. They could feel and taste the moisture in the wind. Sensing the weather was about to change, Wade reined in his UAV while Julia and Browning trained their eyes to catch a glimpse of the mysterious lady in the distance. They were too far away. The black aerial vehicle made a soft landing a few yards from the group. Wade rushed to retrieve it just as the wind began to howl. He knew they were too distant from the high water mark to charge ahead towards the mysterious lady. Instead, he gestured to his companions to retreat across the part of the open field they had traversed and head back at the double quick to their respective vehicles. It began to rain, hard. The cold droplets smashed against the pavement of the parking lot. Heavy rain pouring down like grief onto this most sacred of battlefields. Reaching the vet, Julia did not need to be told where to go. She immediately drove along the tour path with Browning in tow. Frustratingly, their advance was obstructed by the violent weather. Eventually, they reached the other side of the park and the copse of trees. Exiting their vehicles, they felt the airstream diminish in intensity. The rain stopped as it had arrived, suddenly. The dark clouds, however, did not break or disperse, continuing to hang low. Advancing onto the freshly cut, drenched grass, they entered the killing zone and stood amidst the ghosts of the fallen and the immobile, cold, wet stone monuments that were erected as tributes, testimonials, and reminders, marking the silhouette of the battlefield. The gray-haired lady was gone. Wade scanned all directions in the hope of locating her, but his panoramic search was futile. Dejected, he walked the area as he had done on many occasions since his childhood, but this time it was different. It felt personal. He paid a private homage to the soldiers who had once graced this piece of land with their presence long ago, by touching the monuments and stone wall. He then turned to Julia and Browning, addressing them in a low, solemn tone. "It's time to visit Patrick Donovan's grave." Chapter 26. Gettysburg National Cemetery was created for Union casualties within the military park. Originally called Soldiers' National Cemetery, President Abraham Lincoln delivered his Gettysburg address at the cemetery's consecration on November 19, 1863. Today was the anniversary of that famous event. Wade entered the cemetery's confines along with Julia and Browning, set on attending the scheduled commemoration ceremony held every year on this date. Despite the uncertain weather, attendance was good, with folks strolling the grounds to a military band's patriotic tunes. The National Cemetery rostrum, later erected to resemble the stage on which Lincoln gave his historic speech, was filled with dignitaries and honored guests. The proceedings began with a brief welcome to the attendees, followed by a non-denominational prayer, laying of wreaths, and moment of silence. The brass band played the national anthem, the battle hymn of the Republic, and God Bless America. Following the music were various short discourses marking the day's anniversary. Wade and Browning had seen it all before, but Julia was enjoying this first experience. An actor, resembling and dressed as Abraham Lincoln, stood to address the crowd just as a brilliant ray of light pierced the clouds overhead. Respectful applause greeted him as he approached the podium and presented one of the best-known speeches in American history.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Originally delivered 4.5 months after the Union armies defeated those of the Confederacy at the Battle of Gettysburg, this carefully crafted speech was one of the greatest and most influential statements of national purpose. In just over 2 minutes, Lincoln's address restated the principles of human equality embraced by the Declaration of Independence and proclaimed the Civil War as a struggle for the preservation of the Union threatened by the secession crisis. The Commander-in-Chief redefined the bloody war as a fight not just for the Union, but also for the principle of human equality. Abraham Lincoln further examined the founding principles of the country in the context of the Civil War, and memorialized the sacrifices of those who gave their lives at Gettysburg to ensure the survival of America's representative democracy. Wade knew the text well. In his opinion, the Gettysburg Address was beautiful both in written and spoken form, for Lincoln always wrote with 2 senses, the eye and the ear. At the conclusion of the short speech, Wade marveled at the fact that unbeknownst to the president in 1863, his son was one of the many brave young men buried in this very ground he had just consecrated. Chapter 27. The cemetery contains over 3,500 interments from the Civil War, including the graves of almost 1,000 unknowns. Battlefield monuments, memorials, gravestones, section markers, and flags are scattered throughout the cemetery. Stone walls, iron fences, gates, and brick sidewalks give the burial ground an air of reverential dignity. The centerpiece of Gettysburg National Cemetery is Soldiers' National Monument. It is surrounded by concentric semicircles of graves. At the commemoration's end, Wade led his two companions away from the crowd. His ears were still ringing loudly despite having braced himself for the event's closing 21-gun presidential salute. They formed a triangle while Wade extracted the cemetery plan from his inside coat pocket and gauged his next steps. Yesterday's research had revealed the exact location within the cemetery that he wished to explore. Julia and Browning followed his stride towards the appropriate section. When a grayish squirrel skidded across their pathway, Wade stopped and consulted his map again. Lifting his head, he nodded towards the direction he wished to take. Turning towards his acolytes, he encouraged them to follow him. A dozen steps later, he stopped and turned to face a simple gravestone with succinct dramatic markings. Patrick Donovan, 69th Regiment, Pennsylvania Infantry, July 3rd, 1863. Julia took a sidestep towards Wade and reached for his hand. He half smiled at the gesture and turned to meet her eyes. They held their gaze, communicating to each other without words that their quest seemed to be at an end and sadly unsuccessful. Browning moved forward, bent down, and extended his one good arm to unfurl the small Stars and Stripes flag planted by a dedicated volunteer in front of the gravestone for the day's commemoration. He straightened up and cleared his throat, then spoke a few words that would utterly shock his companions. "It's so sad that this young man would never get to know his son." Chapter 28. Browning was not aware of the true nature of Wade's mission. As far as he was concerned, Wade's curiosity was centered on Patrick Donovan's deeds on the battlefield, not necessarily on his personal life. Since arriving in Gettysburg, the Philadelphia Civil War buff had not yet had the time or opportunity to share all of his new findings with the young couple. "What did you just say?" asked Wade, letting go of Julia's hand. "His son! Patrick Donovan never met his son," Browning reaffirmed. "His son? He had a son?" Julia smiled, but immediately retracted it, awaiting the response. "Yeah, he had a son." "How? How do you know this?" Wade pushed for an explanation. "My National Archives friend sent me documents last evening and called to tell me about a pension request from a woman who claimed to be the mother of Patrick Donovan's son." Wade crossed his arms over his chest and listened. "Together, my friend and I reconstructed a timeline and probable scenario." Wade still said nothing, but raised his arms and placed his hands on the back of his head in anticipation. Julia clasped her hands, placing them under her chin. Browning, pleased and flattered by his small audience's rapt attention, continued to relish the telling of his tale. Yeah. He lost his train of thought but quickly retrieved it. "As you know, Donovan arrived in Philadelphia for a few weeks' training before joining his unit here at Gettysburg. During his brief time in Philly, he was apparently not only performing military maneuvers, if you know what I mean." Browning chuckled, but Wade and Julia did not. "Yeah, anyway, it appears he befriended an army nurse working in the city, because 9 months later, Patrick Donovan Jr. was born." He smiled. "And a year after the war ended, in 1866, she put in for a pension. It's all here, Mr. Wade." He removed a standard white envelope filled thick from his coat's side pocket and gave it to Wade. "What was her name?" asked Julia. "Maggie Gillen. She was an Irish girl." He pointed with satisfaction At the envelope Wade was now sifting through and restated, "Yep, it's all there." "Did she get her pension?" Julia pursued. "No," shaking his head. "No, she wasn't married to the father. It was a short wartime dalliance." A dalliance? Wade thought. And a son? That changes everything. Browning removed a small metal flask from his inside coat pocket, loosened the fastener, and took a quick slug. He then extended his arm and offered the container to his companions. The flask was engraved, "For medicinal purposes." Both politely declined his offer with hand gestures. Julia suddenly took a firm step forward. "Over there," she whispered loudly, pointing. "Is that her? There, that lady over there, watching us. It's her." Wade gave Julia the envelope he was holding and bolted towards the stone wall that partially shielded the lady standing outside the enclosed cemetery. Browning and Julia did not attempt to follow him, instead making their way in haste towards the nearby gateway that led to the general area where the lady had been spotted. Browning moved less swiftly, falling slightly behind, his artificial legs slowing him down. Arriving at the wall, Wade climbed over the solid structure without difficulty. Julia moved quickly through the gateway and joined Wade a minute later. Browning arrived not long after. The tall investigator was frantically searching everywhere and nowhere, uncertain on which way to go. He finally lowered his broad shoulders, shook his head, and greeted the arrival of his companions with a sigh of defeat. The gray-haired lady had once again eluded them. Confused, Browning asked Wade to explain his relationship to this woman. Wade, not wanting to discuss the matter, simply passed the incidents off as curious happenstance. Julia helped change the subject by congratulating the older gentleman on his skills as a researcher. Browning graciously accepted the compliment with his best military salute, then announced his departure. "Do contact me any time if I can be of help, and if I find anything else, I'll let you know." They walked him to his car, thanked him for his efforts, and watched as he drove away. Wade retrieved Browning's envelope from Julia and rapidly perused the documents held within. "Now what?" Julia asked, hands on her hips. "Baltimore, my dear. Baltimore." Chapter 29. The city of Baltimore, located below the Mason-Dixon line in the slave state of Maryland, was not a bulwark against secession sentiments leading up to and during the Civil War. Despite being considered a northern city by the federal government, its citizens' sympathies lay elsewhere. The first hour of the 90-minute drive from Gettysburg to Baltimore was done in silence. Julia let Wade work and think. He had spent the travel time reviewing in detail the documents contained in Browning's white envelope and corresponding with his genealogist, André Barthélemy. Julia waited with monastic patience for a signal that they could converse. Wade looked out the side window, nodded, then turned to his favorite driver. "Okay, I got it. Thanks for waiting." Julia gave him a tender smile. "This is what I now can piece together. The mother of Patrick Donovan's son moved to Baltimore after the war. She never got her military pension because of her unwed status, but she gave her son his father's name. It appears she continued to work as a nurse in a Baltimore hospital. Did she ever remarry? No, she lived the remainder of her life as a single unwed mother and died in her 60s in modest circumstances. What about the child? Well, he grew up in Baltimore and worked as a carpenter. He married in his 30s, but his wife died in childbirth along with the baby. He remained a bachelor for decades until he remarried in his 60s to a young, widowed Irish girl. Together they had one child. His only child, a boy, also named Patrick. Fascinating, Julia reacted, eyes on the road. We're approaching the city, David. Where to? Wade checked his phone. Take the next exit, Julia, to the waterfront. Founded in 1729, Baltimore is the second largest seaport in the mid-Atlantic. The city's inner harbor was once a leading port of entry for immigrants and a major manufacturing center. Ah, Baltimore, Wade mused, home of the Babe. What do you mean? Julia asked, perplexed. Wade had told her Babe Ruth was one of his childhood baseball heroes, but she knew the Yankees as a New York team. He was born here, Wade grinned, and another claim to fame for this city is my country's anthem. In the War of 1812, Baltimorean Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, which later became the American national anthem. Baltimorean? Repeated Julia. Baltimorean. I like the sound of that. She giggled. Julia continued to navigate the boulevards and avenues of the Charmed City, also called Bmore by its residents. Formerly known as the Basin, the city's beautiful inner harbor waterfront came into view. Wade told Julia to slow down, then stop momentarily in order to take in the splendid scenery. Wade looked out towards the harbor. This is where Patrick Donovan's son worked a century ago. Julia tried to imagine a busy early 20th century seaport with men of various professions, including carpenters, working along the wharfs. Now, Wade declared, hinting at something big, let's go and visit where Patrick Donovan's grandson lives. Chapter 30. With hundreds of identified districts, Baltimore has been dubbed a city of neighborhoods. Not all the neighborhoods, however, have the same charm. West Baltimore has its challenges, including high unemployment and crime, low median income and home values, and crumbling infrastructure. Notorious for its old, narrow, shallow row houses with their brick stoops, Abraham Lincoln's great-grandson presently inhabited a basement room in one of them. Standing outside a corner building, Julia felt the chill of both the wind and despair circulating in this neighborhood, a place in desperate need of attention. Guessing the front door would not lead them to a basement room, Wade led Julia to the back of the edifice where he found, after descending 6 concrete steps, a frayed wooden door adorned with flakes of paint ready to let go. Approaching the windowless door, Wade searched for a doorbell but found none. He knocked. Silence. He knocked again. More silence, except for the distant screech of tires against the pavement. Julia tried her luck with several knocks of her own. Wade heard the faint sound of movement from within. Julia heard nothing but watched Wade turn his head and place his ear closer to the door as it suddenly rattled. The person handling the knob from inside seemed to be having problems gripping the lever. Finally, the door opened a few inches, restrained by a single linked metal security chain. Yes? The male voice that came forth sounded elderly, but strong. Mr. Donovan? Wade asked amicably. Mr. Patrick Donovan? Yes, came an answer, maintaining a forceful tone. My name is David Wade and this is Julia Cartier. Julia displayed a friendly smile, the type she usually offered to young children. She hoped her pleasant demeanor would make them appear unthreatening, trustworthy, safe, the kind of strangers you open the door to. A hard pair of eyes appeared below the chain. Yes, came a response. Once again, repeating the same and only word yet offered to the couple standing outside his door. We would like to speak with you, Mr. Donovan, about your father. The eyes softened. Could we come into your home for a short while and speak to you about your family? The eyes disappeared. The door closed. Seconds passed. The clinking of metal on metal was heard as the chain was being removed, allowing the door to be slowly opened to reveal a very old man wearing at least 3 sweaters, fingerless gloves, and a moth-eaten woolen cap. "Come in." The strength of his speech did not match his fragile appearance. This man was in his 90s, but his voice sounded much younger. They entered the Spartan one-room walk-down and followed their host into a space with 4 walls. 4 grayish, bare walls that were probably once white. The room seemed lonely and untidy. If every man's home is his castle, then this castle was in serious need of some TLC. They took a few steps to a square table, the only table in the room. The elderly man sat down in a beat-up brown Chesterfield while Wade took hold of the lone table chair and offered it to Julia. Wade remained standing. A disheveled single bed lay nearby next to a small compact refrigerator with a stained electric coil hot plate on top. A stale odor permeated the unventilated space, making it somewhat difficult to breathe. Julia removed her gloves and felt the sticky table beneath her hands. She restrained from displaying a genuine feeling of disgust and revulsion. She was a bit of a germ freak. Julia now regretted having accepted Wade's offer for the only chair. The fragile old man, thin and bony at the hips and shoulders, sat on the single couch with both feet stationed upon the floor, each hand laying upon the sofa's threadbare armrests. He listened attentively to the young man's detailed explanation of his mission on behalf of the Smithsonian and the request for his participation. Wade didn't usually mention client names, but he felt it necessary in this case, judging that the Smithsonian name and reputation would add credence to his tale and imminent request. The old man did not interrupt his guest. He continued listening with his mouth half open, like old folks do. Julia was not paying attention, preoccupied by the unsanitary state of the old gentleman's living space. She thought her mental use of the word gentleman seemed appropriate. She disliked that the word was too often wrongly employed and attributed to unsavory characters. This feeble-looking human sitting opposite her, however, actually looked like a gentle man. "Mr. Donovan." "Call me Pat." Once again, his voice was strong, solid, even though he physically looked quite the opposite. Wade smiled. "Pat, I now have something quite startling to tell you." The old man did not flinch, his empty, closed mouth now moving as if chewing, like old folks do. "You are Abraham Lincoln's great-great-grandson." Pat stopped his phantom chewing and stared at Wade. No reaction, hardly blinking. "Mr. Donovan," Wade began repeating, using different words. "Pat, you are the direct descendant of the 16th President of the United States." The old man continued to stare at Wade. Then slowly, very slowly, like a rusty kettle of water beginning to simmer, then boil, the old man started to giggle and chuckle, then laugh, and laugh, and laugh, and laugh. Chapter 31. Julia could not help herself, laughing along with mixed feelings of joy, trepidation, and nervousness. Wade was not laughing, waiting tensely for Pat's next reaction. "My days are numbered, young man, and as you can see," he gestured around his small apartment, "I don't have much. I've had a rough life, led a sad life, an unproductive life. I will die alone, without family or friends, not even a cat." Julia spotted a faded photo of a yellowish alley cat, most probably deceased, on the small nightstand next to his bed. "If you really want to give me money for a few samples of my decrepit carcass, then go right ahead. I think you're crazy or seriously addled, but who am I to stop you from making a fool of yourself?" He resumed his laughter, albeit more measured this time. Wade was not hurt or angered by the words thrown at him. Instead, he was pleased with the old man's good-natured reaction and acquiescence. From his left inside jacket pocket, he removed a white folded paper. Then from the right side, he extracted a beige envelope. The paper was a waiver, promptly signed by the old man with a fancy pen offered to him by Wade. Pat then glanced inside the envelope at the multitude of high-denominational currency bills that now belonged to him in exchange for samples of his DNA. Wade signaled Julia to begin the process of extracting 4 samples of raw DNA from their patient. She reached into her coat pocket and removed her smartphone, placed it on the table, then returned to the same pocket and produced a small plastic container with the sterile items needed to accomplish the task Wade had carefully explained to her minutes before their arrival. With a smile and gentle hands, she probed the inside of the old man's mouth with a cotton swab, retrieved saliva in a collection tube, used tweezers to extract from the back of his head a few hair strands, and finally, she pricked his thumb with a pin and scooped up a few drops of blood into a transparent vial and inserted it for storage in a separate temperature-controlled part of the container, thereby assuring its stability and optimum DNA yield and quality. Wade watched the whole process, except for the bloodletting, preferring to turn away, the sight of blood being a weakness of his. The simple and benign tasks completed, Pat kindly offered to rummage through his meager things to find any family mementos, documents, or photos he might still possess, and give them to Wade. Julia saw her travel companion's face light up at the generous offer. As the old man stood, Julia suggested that she and Wade go for a short walk around the block for some fresh air, while Pat did his rummaging. Wade agreed. Pat shrugged at the idea, denoting no objection. Once outside, Julia took a deep breath of air, pleased to have escaped the stale confines of the subterranean chamber. They returned to their car where Julia placed a small container with the DNA samples in the glove compartment. They walked to a nearby corner store and each purchased bottled drinks and a snack, Wade opting for his favorite candy bar and Julia choosing a bag of trail mix. She stored the treat in her coat pocket and when doing so realized she had forgotten her phone on Pat's table. Without her cell, she felt strange. They immediately returned to the basement dwelling, finding the entrance door slightly open. They pushed the door, announced themselves, and stepped inside. Julia felt a violent whack to the side of her head and fell to the floor unconscious. Wade felt a similar sharp, resounding blow that also brought him down, but he remained conscious long enough to witness Pat being forced out the door with a 6-shooter held at his back by a woman, the gray-haired lady. Chapter 32. Julia Cartier arrived at her flat in Milan, kicked off her shoes, and began unpacking. She made herself a cappuccino and ran a bath. Tired from the long overseas flight, she undressed and approached the steaming hot water, which she tested by dipping her fingertips into the scalding water. What happened? Opening her eyes, she saw David Wade looking down at her with grave concern. "You've been unconscious for a while, Julia." Where am I?" she asked groggily, her mind no longer wandering in another dimension. Wade placed a cool face cloth on her forehead. "You're in Baltimore. We were just assaulted, hit on the head by a revolver, pistol whipped." Dazed, confused, disoriented, Julia heard his words but made no sense of them until it suddenly all came back to her like a big bang. She tried to lift her head but abandoned the attempt. Wade had not completely blacked out, but had remained on the floor in a state of disoriented pain for at least 20 minutes, semi-conscious, drifting in and out. Upon regaining his bearings, he had moved Julia off the soiled carpet to Pat's tiny bed. "Who attacked us?" Wade noticed her voice was regaining some of its usual vigor. "That lady, with the gray hair." He returned with a second cool cloth, trading it for the one already losing its effect. Julia wanted to react and comment on what she had just heard, but felt it best to simply lay still and regain her strength. "You're not cut, Julia, but you will feel the pain and the bump on the back of your skull for a while. You may have a slight concussion. I want to get you to a hospital." "No," she protested loudly. "No, David. Wait. Give me a few minutes before doing that." Wade began pacing the small room. He did his best thinking when pacing, even in a very tight space. Julia awkwardly sat up, the cloth on her forehead falling to her lap. "Now I remember. We came back here to get my phone. Yes. I forgot my phone on the table." Wade searched on and below the table but saw nothing. "Are you sure you left it on the table?" 100% sure, David. That, at least, I remember clearly." "Well, it's not here, and—" Wade stopped in mid-sentence. "That lady! She must have taken it along with Pat." "What are you talking about?" Julia asked. Wade quickly explained what he saw after he was hit and fell. Julia was astonished and shocked at what had transpired in this little basement. Wade resumed pacing. His brain entered a minefield of thoughts. He smote his hands together a number of times in an absent sort of way until he fist-pumped and stopped. He moved towards Julia and got down to her level on both knees. Looking straight into her eyes, he announced, "I don't know who that lady is and why she attacked us and abducted Pat. But one thing I do know, she just made her first mistake." Chapter 33. The pink Corvette was safe, still locked and parked on the street where it had been left. Wade rushed back to the basement flat to check on Julia, who had resumed her horizontal position on the bed's thin mattress. He sat in the solitary sofa and fired off a missive to Rajiv, instructing him to track Julia's cell. Using the phone's coordinates, Denary's tech guy was quickly able to locate the device and send his boss a real-time map of its location and its live movements. "Julia," he whispered, hovering over her. "Julia." Wade got back on his knees next to the low bed. He held his precious friend's hand and tried to awake her. "Julia, we have to go." She opened her eyes with a blind look, turned her head slightly, then grabbed Wade by the neck, hugged him as if forever, then let go. He spoke more forcefully. "We need to move, either to the hospital or back on the road." Julia offered a weak smile, but with facial hints of alertness. "I am all right, David. No hospital, no clinic." "Are you sure?" His voice returning to a tone of lightness. "Certain. I am weak, but not in difficulty. How are you?" "I'm okay. Bruised only." He helped her up, and together they left the drab room. Julia's steps were confident and her vision clear, but Wade insisted on driving. She did not argue, accepting the role of passenger and navigator. Wade did not like driving, but assumed the part without complaint. He handed Julia his tablet and informed her about its tracking of her phone. "That's great, David, and amazing." "As you can see, sweetheart, your cell is traveling south on the main highway." Wade started Julia's streamlined machine and hit the road. "He called me sweetheart," she reflected. "Is that sweetheart In the affectionate way? Or just another word for the opposite sex, in the Humphrey Bogart way? For the next few seconds, Julia replaced the pain of her injury by the pleasure of being called sweetheart by David Wade. Chapter 34. The Maryland Interstate Highway became Virginia's interstate once they accelerated full throttle south across the state lines. The 50-minute head start had allowed Pat's abductor to arrive at her destination while Julia and Wade were still racing along the thoroughfare. "I think they stopped," Julia announced. "Yes, they are no longer moving." "Can you drive now?" Feeling much better, she nodded. "You're sure?" She again nodded. Wade took the next service road, stopped near a gas station, and traded places with Julia, who regained the freeway, foot down. Pleased on returning to his familiar station as passenger, Wade worked his devices. He identified the exact location of the gray-haired lady's car. It was immobile next to a large house 11 miles northeast of Virginia's capital city. Richmond was the national capital of the Confederacy during the Civil War and became the main target of Union armies. The city surrendered to federal forces in April 1865 after Southern government officials charred and destroyed documents, and departing rebel troops burned tobacco and other warehouses to deny its contents to the victors. The fire spread and the city fast became smoldering rubble. Sasha Kirov was Denary's intelligence agent, capable of assisting Wade with local, regional, and national law enforcement agencies around the world. Based in Russia, Sasha was the only member of Denary that worked strictly on the basis of written exchanges. Wade had never seen or spoken to Sasha Kirov, but had often benefited from his or her expertise. "SK, I am presently in the Richmond, Virginia, USA area with need of police assistance. Do not alert them as yet, but send me direct high-level contact info. DW." Within minutes, Wade received from Sasha several names connected to the Richmond City Police, Virginia State Police, and the FBI at Quantico, Virginia. "Exit here, Julia." On the mend, Julia was feeling unexpected exhilaration from the chase. They wound up and down the beautiful rolling hills and countryside of the James River Valley to Hanover County. Approaching the area where Pat had been driven, Wade told Julia to stop at a safe distance from the long driveway to the house. Shielded by several venerable canopy trees, Wade gave liftoff to his drone and piloted it over the targeted house. His screen displayed a vehicle, but it was parked close to a clapboard shed in a way that made it impossible to view its license plate. The immediate surroundings of the house and its large front porch showed no signs of life. Then suddenly, a side door opened. Wade fixed one of the drone's cameras onto the person that stepped outside and moved towards the car to retrieve a long item wrapped in sheets or a thin carpet. Before re-entering the house, the rotorcraft was able, under Wade's command, to focus in on the individual. It was definitely the gray-haired lady. Wade had seen enough. He was now ready to approach the house. Actually, it was much more than just a normal or regular house. It was an old historic home built in 1840, the Edmund Ruffin Plantation House. Chapter 35. Wade sent urgent separate texts to André Barthélemy and Hewitt Fothergill, explaining where he was and asking for any helpful information. He then contacted the police. Reluctant to intervene without the authorities, Wade nevertheless wanted to get closer to the building. He tried to dissuade Julia from accompanying him, but she would have none of it. Together they walked onto the vast estate front lawn and hid behind trunks of the many gigantic trees lining the private road leading to the main house. The grounds were run down and somewhat neglected, long past their antebellum glory days. The relative safety of the car was now well behind them as they worked their way to the large 19th century mansion. If anything went wrong, or if they met trouble, the way back would be far, long, and wide open. Approaching the house, Wade's e-watch signaled the arrival of missives from Denary members. The staccato chime startled Julia, prompting Wade to immediately switch the alert function to vibrate. They approached to within 10 yards of one of the side windows, where they would be able to get a good view inside. Contemplating their next move, Wade signaled to Julia his cavalier intention of running up to the house on his own. This she agreed to. He took one step around the tree that was their final shield and stopped in his tracks upon hearing a scream. They both heard the loud cry of a human being in pain. Severe pain. Excruciating pain. The kind of pain one hopes never to experience. Wade instantly rushed towards the veranda with Julia close behind. They bounded up the wooden stairs onto the porch and swung open the screen door. Entering, they were greeted by the explosion of a gun, paining Wade's ears. It didn't sound like a pistol, but more like a shotgun. Not a modern weapon, an old rifle from another era. Adrenaline spurred and unconcerned for their own safety, they rapidly burst into each of the high-ceiling rooms on the ground floor. Finding them empty, they raced up the grand main staircase to the upper level. The first room they entered laid out a horrific scene. A pair of humans, slouched over in two separate chairs, bleeding profusely. Wade steadied himself, one hand on an armoire and the other over his heaving chest. The strength seemed to go out of his limbs as he witnessed the bloody mess. Julia covered her mouth and shut her eyes, then slowly came back to the scene. Wade could not detect the sounds of breath being drawn by either of the mutilated bodies. Pat Donovan, Abraham Lincoln's last living direct descendant, was dead, a victim of multiple bayonet wounds viciously inflicted on him by the person seated only a few feet away, a gray-haired lady, herself killed by placing a shotgun in her mouth and, using the ramrod, pressing the trigger. Chapter 36. Edmund Ruffin, a wealthy Virginia planter, slaveholder, and a pioneer in agricultural improvements, worked to reform agriculture in the South, promoting crop rotation and soil conservation. Considered the distinguished father of soil science in the U.S., Ruffin experimented with agricultural methods. As a radical political activist, he gained attention as one of a number of secessionist, pro-slavery extremists known as fire eaters. He traveled to South Carolina and proudly fired the first gun on Fort Sumter in 1861, thus starting the American Civil War. He hated Abraham Lincoln. Despondent after Robert E. Lee's surrender in April 1865, he left a note proclaiming his unmitigated hatred to Yankee rule, to all political, social, and business connections with Yankees, and to the perfidious, malignant, and vile Yankee race, and committed suicide. He seated himself, and placing the muzzle of the musket in his mouth, used a forked stick to manipulate the trigger and landed his spirit into the eternal world, with a desperate and unnatural coolness. He is buried on the grounds of this estate not far from the gruesome acts of his great-great-granddaughter, Susan Ruffin, the gray-haired lady. Over the next several hours, at Wade's urgent request, law enforcement officers and agents from 3 different jurisdictions arrived at the house. Wade had interacted long distance with various Denary components and Doris Shelby of the Smithsonian, trying to piece together why this had happened. Julia having watched closely while a team of police investigators, medical personnel, and coroners examined the crime scene and the bodies, now approached Wade. "Why did she do it?" Julia asked him and herself. "Revenge," Wade explained coldly. "Revenge and hatred." The bodies still remained seated. A bloody bayonet lay on the floor next to Pat's chair and a silver-mounted rifle next to the lady who authored this horribly tragic outcome. The gun was an antique once owned by the lady's famous ancestor, the same weapon he had used to end his life. Wade was devastated by the day's shocking conclusion, feeling responsible for the old man's murder. By now, Julia was aware of the killer's identity and pedigree, but remained confused. "David, how could she still harbor such negative feelings about events that took place so long ago?" Wade refrained from answering until he had led Julia outside to view Edmund Ruffin's gravesite. Susan Ruffin, named in honor of her great-great-grandmother, Edmund's wife, worked at the Museum and White House of the Confederacy in Richmond, the Confederate States' counterpart to the White House in Washington. She was known by her co-workers as harboring anti-Northern sentiments in a bizarre and delusional way, but they all considered her harmless. Wade leaned forward and placed his hands on the 3-foot-high black wrought iron fence enclosing the grave. Anyway, Susan Ruffin traveled to the Smithsonian on behalf of her employer on the same day we were there. Her routine assignment was to retrieve a small museum piece on loan to the Smithsonian. While I communed with Doris Shelby in her office, she noticed a Lincoln DNA file on the reception counter, waiting to be copied for me. A security camera reveals that her curiosity got the better of her. He drew in a deep breath, then resumed. She secretly sifted through the dossier while the receptionist went for the package containing the loan museum item. Aware of my mission, she then followed our every move and took it upon herself to eradicate the last living connection to, in her view, the tyrannical president that had unlawfully invaded her ancestors' homeland. Julia stared at the weathered tombstone and its faded inscription, "Numb." Wade momentarily placed his hand upon hers. His touch felt like a safe haven to her. Wade passed his other hand through his thick hair and sighed. He then folded his arms over his chest and mused aloud. With his suicide, Edmund Ruffin became known as having fired the first and last shots of the Civil War. But now, the mystic chords of memory may have to be revisited. Perhaps the last shot of that calamitous and bloody conflict was actually fired here, today. Epilogue. The final day of autumn brought forth kinder, gentler weather, an unconcealed sun, and a warmer breeze, a final gasp of Indian summer. Early morning Washington City was alive, vibrant, and busy, as all great capitals usually are. David Wade and Julia Cartier had returned to the district late the night before and headed the next morning to the Smithsonian Castle to meet with its boss, Doris Shelby. Despite the tragic end, Wade had accomplished his mission for the institution and its anonymous corporate donor. They were extremely grateful. As the couple left the inside of the building to re-engage with the pleasant morning air, Wade noticed a familiar face walking towards him, heading for the building entrance. Andalusia? A pretty young woman dressed in a classic business dress suit focused on the man calling her name. Recognizing him, she erupted. "David! David!" She jumped into his arms and kissed him on the lips. Julia was startled. "What are you doing here?" the effervescent woman asked. Business." "Yeah, I know. I can imagine." She laughed and hugged Wade a second time. Julia, having never seen or heard of this woman, was not pleased. Wade introduced Andalusia, then excused himself and walked off to speak with the brown-haired beauty in private. Julia left standing alone, was now irritated. Unbeknownst to Julia was the fact that Andalusia was part of Denary, Wade's linguistic expert. Working for the United Nations as a high-level translator often brought her to the U.S. Capitol. Wade would have known she was in town had he checked his Denary tracking data. He did not, however, mind bumping into his former girlfriend in this manner and decided to use the chance meeting to discuss a few work-related issues with her. They spoke for a long while. Andalusia listened attentively to Wade's discourse with eyes that clearly meant more than business. Despite their short, intensive, passionate relationship, long ago ended, Andalusia had not completely moved on. She had fallen in love with Wade, fallen hard, but now fully understood and accepted the nature of their business relationship, a professional association entered into some time after their romantic disunion. Despite that, whenever they met in person, she had a hard time keeping her lovely hands off of him, and this time was no exception. She first placed her arm around his waist when walking, then put her hand on the side of his neck when they stopped, and now stood so close to him that her thigh rubbed against his. Julia was upset, her heart sinking. The conversation finally ended. The two parted ways with a kiss on the cheek that seemed less innocent than the standard polite version. Julia fumed, distraught. Wade rejoined her, totally oblivious to the range of emotions she had been through during the past few minutes. Julia said nothing. Smiling and looking towards the clear blue autumn sky, Wade pulled out his stylish shades and encouraged Julia to do the same. She did. "Let's walk," he suggested. They did. The National Mall was coming to life with people of all kinds, wearing different types of attire and heading in different directions. They strolled the wide public place towards the Washington Monument, then past the various war memorials along the tidal basin to the steps of the temple they had briefly viewed from their vehicle upon entering the mall a few days ago. By now, the pleasant walk without words had helped diffuse Julia's spectrum of emotions into one that was filled with dear friendship and affection. But could there be more? She wondered. Could this become more? She looked at him with dark promising eyes as if to say something, but chose not to. She instead swept the long hair from her neck and tilted her head slightly forward. Standing together at the base of the steps leading up to the iconic National Monument, Wade silently offered Julia his arm, and silently she took it. They climbed as one, unconsciously synchronizing their steps. Arriving at the summit, they advanced into the heart of the memorial and stood inside the central chamber facing the gigantic sculpture carved to honor the image of the 16th President of the United States. They both removed their sunglasses. He put his hand on her delicate shoulder and brought her close. Having touched the better angels of our nature, now he belongs to the ages, sweetheart. Now he belongs to the ages. The end. I'm Mark Vinet, and I hope you enjoyed the listen.